I'll kick off if everybody's ready. Edgar, if you're ready, I'll just kick up with some housekeeping things. We're at 40 participants already, which is a phenomenal number. There are a lot of people who registered, and I think people will be joining us over the afternoon. The idea of DIIESL was it was originally started by Wendy, who's joining us, Wendy Gunther, who's joining us later on, and Mark Thompson, and then I was involved very early on, and we've renamed it DIIESL as an idea to have a seminar series originally centered around London. The idea was that we would get together physically and meet and discuss a range of topics around the digital space, digital innovation, digital economy, etc., and was to have it as an open forum. Ironically, we've now moved for this first seminar in DIIESL to an online environment, and it's hopefully will work well. And our intention is that even if we return to physical meetings, we will continue to host these online as well, so people will from around the world can continue to attend this seminar series. Just from basic housekeeping, the idea is that we have a lot of discussion as well as presentations, but if we could ask people to mute their microphones and ask questions and participate through chat, that would be probably better given the large number of people who are attending. And we will invite you to turn on audio if we think that that would help elaborate your question, or we think that there's a kind of a need for that. But if we could just have that. In terms of contacting the speakers, you feel free to email them afterwards. We'll try to build so you can contact them and talk to them. I'm going to hand over to the speakers. We've got quite a packed afternoon, but we've put in some contingency. So there is an hour break in the middle. The schedule has been sent to you in the email you just received about 10 minutes ago. And I can share it in a minute on the group chat. But we're reasonably flexible in terms of time. I want the conversation to flow, really. So we may start some things early if we're finishing, if something goes quicker, or we may delay a little bit, but we still aim to have an hour break in the middle. So just to finish on the housekeeping, in the event of a fire, you obviously exit by your own emergency exit, but don't expect us to join you. We won't be doing that. And we would normally invite people to retire to a pub locally to have a drink, but unfortunately that's not available now. But without further ado, I'm just going to introduce my colleague Edgar, who's going to be kicking off the session and talking to us. Edgar's well known in our field, particularly for his work on identity. He's the co-editor of the Journal Information Technology and People, a senior editor at Journal of Information Technology. He's co-chair of the UK Cabinet Office Privacy and Consumer Advisory Group, and has advised a number of governments around the world on issues of identity. And I really wanted to involve Edgar because I think COVID raises a huge numbers of questions around privacy and identity, and I'm sure Edgar's perfectly pitched to fill us in on that. So Edgar, may I hand over to you?
Of course. So welcome everybody. I suspect that Steve in Washington DC may not be rushing to have a drink straight after the seminar, because that might be a little bit early in the day. So what I want to talk about is the question of how we manage digital identities online. This is work that has been ongoing in my own particular research interest for quite a while, and some of the materials that I will be showing are related to activities that I was involved with helping the UK government in its next steps just before COVID has hit. And in particular, there are some things that everyone kind of assumes were happening but haven't necessarily been making it to the public domain. But as I understand it, they will be made public officially fairly shortly, and there's no great surprises about what I'm going to be disclosing. But in parallel to the stuff that was kind of happening pre-COVID, there's also been a set of innovations, digital innovations, particularly around identity, that have arisen from the COVID lockdowns, particularly the idea that lots of the traditional ID checks that we do, showing somebody your documents, going to a post office or to a HR department or whatever, that just cannot happen or could not happen when we were in total lockdown, and people have therefore made that kind of fantastic transformation to online ID activities. And then I want to kind of reflect on what was happening pre-COVID, what's happened whilst COVID lockdown has happened, and what that might mean for the future going forwards. So this is just one illustration. This is actually from the Land Registry, a blog post from May 2020, where they were talking about the fact that they are going to have to do an awful lot of ID checking in an online mode. So this is things like buying houses, signing mortgage deeds, all of the kind of legal paperwork associated with property transactions. It's also telling that the imagery that they use for these news stories is focused on biometrics, and I'll come back to that in a second. So this is the text from that particular story. The current crisis has highlighted the immediate need for an easy-to-use, modestly priced, remote and digitally secure way for conveyancers or whoever to securely identify the buyers and sellers of a property. And that's very much the activity that digital ID systems have always tried to address, to do things securely, to identify whether it's buyers and sellers of properties, whether it's potential employees, the person who's submitting their tax return or whatever. It's arguably not an immediate need. This is a need that has been ongoing for quite some time, but certainly COVID has kind of reinforced the requirements associated with it. And I know that many people will have seen cartoons or surveys kind of like this on their social media. Who led the digital transformation of your company? The CEO, the Chief Technology Officer, or answer C, COVID-19. So forcing you to rely on increased digital activities as a result of COVID rather than anything else. And that has been very, very good for pushing transformations. But there's an important distinction between something that's good enough for making do, for not letting the organization collapse completely, and a broader concern about using digital IDs, in my particular research interest, as part of an ongoing, stable and reliable future activity. Somebody's mic is on and we're getting wonderful feedback loops. I like hearing myself, but preferably directly rather than indirectly. So again, here's a story about the coronavirus jump-starting the race for digital ID. Arguably, this is a race that has been ongoing for quite a while, rather than something that has been jump-started. I've just got the chat up. Yes, digital technology deployment and digital transformation. I think in terms of digital identity, a key part of this is about the transformations around how digital feeds into your activities. Just in terms of language, it's important to differentiate between different parts of what a digital identity system does. One element is the identification, the establishment of the identity where that's required. This is linking the digital credential to a physical person. Second stage is authentication, which says, I am in control of this digital identity and I therefore want to do that. And then authorization that says, given that we know who the person is and they are the person who's logged in, what kinds of services, what kinds of activities are they allowed to do? It's important that we differentiate between the notion of identification which is the kind of ID proofing, who do you know who the person is who's you're transacting with, and the authentication, is this the person who's in charge of that? Because we'll see that lots of the particularly COVID related innovations have been much more focused on authentication using biometrics, etc., than on the original identification. So in particular, looking at the UK, both before and after COVID, the major player in terms of a digital identity system for the UK is gov.uk Verify. This is a system that's been running for a number of years now and provides secure online access to 22 public sector services, such as social work, universal credit, digital services, getting your state pension, renewing your short-term medical driving license. So if you've got a ongoing medical condition where you sometimes aren't able to drive and then you get an updated evaluation where you now are able to drive again, then you can do that electronically using your Verify account, signing your mortgage deed, self-assessment tax returns, disclosure and borrowing service. That again became incredibly important, with lots of people volunteering to help with their local communities, and pension services as well. The activity that I was particularly involved with just before COVID lockdown hit was a pilot that was being run by the Department of Digital, Culture, Media and Sport and the Government Digital Service, which was a pilot around allowing private sector organizations to use the government's document checking service. The idea of the document checking service is it provides a digital access to the passport database in a secure manner to authorized agencies, and allows the querying party to get a yes/no response as to whether the passport details that they are presenting are found in the passport database and do not have any flags associated with them. Essentially saying, is this a valid live passport? So for example, if you stole somebody's British passport and tried to use it to create a digital ID, the document checking service would simply say, no, that's not a valid passport, because if it's been reported as being lost or stolen, and therefore should not be used as a basis for the activities. So 15 commercial private sector companies submitted applications to join the pilot to have access to the passport service as part of that proof of ID kind of activity. We undertook the evaluations in early March, just before everyone went into lockdown, and a large part of the team that were associated with that then got pivoted to COVID-19 responses. Although having done our evaluation, my understanding is that the onboarding process, sorting out technical API connections, etc., was ongoing. It just took a little bit of time for that to happen. It's been going on quietly rather than through official press announcements. So that was kind of happening just before COVID, and it was there specifically to help with the ID proofing element. But there's also been a large number of digital innovations that are kind of independent of that pilot. One very early COVID response was the company Yoti, who were providing secure digital IDs for NHS employees to allow them to prove that they were working for the NHS in a number of environments, both physically by showing their phone and their smartphone and the Yoti approved credential, but also for online. There had been a number of unfortunate cases at the beginning of the crisis of NHS workers being mugged, not for their money, but for their NHS pass. I presume on the assumption that that would get you into a supermarket early in the morning so that you could get access to food or whatever it was. A little bit of a strange one, but Yoti are there working with NHS to say, we know that this person is an NHS employee and we can therefore certify that. More recently, Eurostar are proposing to use a biometric system to reduce the need to have to kind of show your passport if you are entering Eurostar. If you want to travel to Europe or from Europe back, you can use a biometric system that will basically scan your face, check that against the image on your passport, and allow you through the Eurostar activities with a lot less hassle, and certainly no handling of paper documents to and from various individuals. Equifax is partnered with another startup, ensue, for digital customer onboarding as part of the Know Your Customer activities, because particularly in the kind of financial services, you do need to know who the person is to satisfy various regulatory requirements. Verify also very helpfully has key performance data available in the publicly available dashboard. And I thought it'd be very interesting just to compare pre and post-COVID take-ups. So this is the first 25 weeks in 2009, first 25 weeks of the year in 2019, showing roughly between 40 and 50,000 people signing up. A little bit of a peak at the beginning of the year because that's close to the self-assessment tax return deadline. In 2020, there is that peak around weeks 4 and 5, which is again around the self-assessment deadline. And then you see weeks 11, 12, 13, 14, a huge spike in the number of people signing up to get a digital ID from gov.uk Verify, partly as a response to being made redundant, being furloughed, having to apply for universal credit. One consequence of that is that there was an element of delay for the physical checking of documents. That got resolved. The process got redesigned very, very rapidly. They were also able to take advantage of a large number of passport checkers who were no longer doing passport checks at airports and ports. And also in parallel, DWP used a slightly different form of digital ID checking, which was Government Gateway, as an initial point of entry into the universal credit application process, but that needed to be followed up with internal practices and organizational activities. Similar fluctuation in terms of the number of sign-ins. So again, at the beginning of the year, up to 200,000 sign-ins per week, typically associated with tax returns, not least because even if you managed to submit your tax return in one go, you had to sign in again at the end of the process to confirm that it was you completing the tax return. So normally around 100,000 sign-ins. In 2020, that's gone up by a similar kind of spike at the beginning of the year, but the normal number of sign-ins has again increased because of COVID. In parallel to this, and again, kind of fortunate timing, FATF, the Federation Against Financial Fraud, which is kind of anti-terrorism concerns, have been very clear about the guidance for digital onboarding and using the digital IDs to do know your customer checks so that people can continue to be involved. And they have a very simple guidance. Basically, it says, do you have a digital ID system that's authorized by government for use in customer due diligence? Yes, then use it. If not, do you have a system that is reasonably robust? Yes. Does it give you assurance that you require? Yes, then use it. If not, either perform the assessment, or if it doesn't give you the level of assurance that you need, don't use it. So a very, very simple set of guidance there. Again, interestingly, and I see that Sylvia's here, that lots of people use have been using biometrics as part of that process. Clearly an important distinction between the your ID checking using biometrics on the device under your own control, so using fingerprints or face to unlock your activities, or alternatively using a fingerprint reader, say in a public space, say in a bank or in a welfare center, and obviously nobody's going to rush to put their fingerprints there. Some reflections just as I come to an end and we get on to the fascinating questions that have been popping up. Remember, we're talking about the distinction between identification and authentication. And so a lot of these innovations have been around, the COVID innovations have been around focusing on authentication and using biometrics. And that seems a very, very sensible way forward. It does, however, raise important questions. If you are interested in tying this to a known person, how you tie this into, for example, it's great doing a selfie and checking it against a photo, but where is that photo from? Well, it needs to be typically based on a government issued photo ID document, which in the UK is either a passport or a driving license. And there's much less focus in this kind of rapid environment on the identification stage. And as Will notes in his chat question, there are huge issues about inclusion and coverage if you are linking the authentication back to official documentation. So a couple of years ago, there was a report pointing out that young teenagers are much less likely to learn to drive and therefore much less likely to need to have a driving license. If they're also not traveling abroad, they don't need a passport. So it's all very well doing a face biometric to check against the document, but what are you going to check that against? So you have important issues of inclusion and coverage. We also have the issue that lots of these changes are being labeled as temporary changes. So again, this is from the Land Registry. These are temporary changes to verifying a person's identity and for signing deeds, reviewing practice. So there is some transformation where you're really thinking through what is it that you actually needed to do for your activities. But there's also a real risk that these temporary fixes will lead to a huge increase in online fraud. So it's a good, helpful step in the middle, but we also need to be thinking ahead about the risks of increased levels of fraud. So, for example, this is a report suggesting that guidance that says that you can accept a scanned document where you can only look at and do a visual inspection of some of the anti-fraud measures amounts to a money launderer's charter. HMRC have already flagged up that the job retention scheme that the UK government introduced is being targeted for organised crime, because basically this is the government giving away money. And if the government's giving away money, then any weaknesses in that process are likely to be problematic. And it's really unclear about the extent to which particularly Government Gateway addresses the limitations and the fraud gaps that can potentially arise. Now, it's not saying that Verify is perfect, but Gateway is has fewer steps because it's an easier process. They want a lighter touch. But the risk of that, of course, is that if you don't have other measures in place, you're actually increasing the risk of fraud. This is somebody reflecting that the pandemic blindsided us. Should we now be watching out for the surge of online fraud, or what are the things that we can actually do to address that? The other thing that's not really being identified so far is the question of the user experience. So we've got all of these different apps, these different packages, all doing very, very useful, helpful things to address individual problems. But think about it from the individual citizen. I'm an NHS employee, say, and therefore I enroll with Yoti to get my digital ID on my smartphone so that I can prove the help online. I also have a holiday booked going on Eurostar, so I need to enroll with iProve so that I can go through the Eurostar boarding process more smoothly. And let's say I'm signing up for some experience services, so I need to enroll with WhoU as well. And there's going to be many more examples depending on particular services and particular products. So we've got issues about increasing fraud, we've got issues around the user experience. And you've also got issues for the relying party, the person that's going to be consuming that digital identity. What happens if lots of people have signed up with Yoti who then suddenly want to sign up and use the Eurostar service? How does Eurostar have two different identity providers? Are iProve going to be very comfortable with the idea of letting another company potentially steal a large number of their consumers? So I talked in the title about interoperability. I think that is an important way of addressing these kinds of considerations. So rather than saying you can do this with this person's app or do that with that person's app, we need to think about the underlying standards, the underlying levels of assurance that we need to do. And so there's going to be a likely discussion / fight about which standards we want to use. But if we do have standards, then we have important opportunities for interoperability. That also then raises questions of governance. So who is going to govern the use of those standards? Who is going to ensure, for example, that those standards include appropriate privacy protections and aren't just an opportunity for any of these companies to get a large number of images that they can then run through their machine learning algorithms and sell those data to, I don't know, police forces, given that Microsoft and Amazon are not doing that at the moment. The other one, from an academic perspective, that lots of people are proposing is the idea of self-sovereign IDs, which are great from the authentication and for limiting the visibility of who's checking your ID, but they are less clear about how you would do that initial ID proofing at the start. And with that, I will finish and open to comments and questions.
Thank you, Edgar. We've had a huge range of interesting questions going forward. I'm just going to pick on one. Let me just find. Mark asked, the UK Verify ID platform has obviously had a checkered past and its future has recently been under doubt. Do you see this extraordinary spike in signups as a possible lifeline for Verify?
My understanding is that, so formally, it's previously been agreed that there will be a transition out from Verify per se. The coronavirus led to an automatic extension of those plans, if nothing else because people were busy focusing on other activities like making sure that people could get their benefits. My understanding is that the plans are still to transition away from Verify per se, but the gap that's then left comes back to this issue of standards and interoperability. So I think, depending on how you count Verify, or what you label as being in scope as to Verify. So the technical materials are there, the APIs, etc., and that's where the document checking service pilot is there. The provision of services remains, and then everyone needs to move to accepting perhaps a wider range of digital IDs. And that wider range of digital IDs ought to be based on standards so that you can consume from whichever ID provider is approved in whichever governance arrangement you have. So a lifeline kind of depends on what, but we're up to almost 7 million users, and it was averaging about 30,000 signups a week. That's now averaging 50 to 60,000 signups a week. I suspect as furlough comes to an end and companies realize that they are actually not viable, or that they don't want to pay national insurance and then 20% of the salary contributions, we are going to see a huge increase in people being made redundant and therefore seeking benefits. And so you're going to increase this requirement for digital ID services because you don't want to be targeted by even more fraudsters.
Mm. Sylvia Macero asked a more global question of the use of biometrics to access social welfare systems are changing as a result of COVID-19. And she says that we know that the Aadhaar-based ID system is being suspended for food security in Indian states. And are you aware of similar measures of social protection in systems worldwide? And I think you could broaden that question to say, just a more general question of globally, what's been happening to identity and access to social security? Are there any really interesting changes that have happened because of COVID?
I think this is one which is really a case of watch and see how it develops. But what it is certainly pushing, on the one hand, it raises the question of how much of a problem of fraud did you have? So if you are using an ID system just to get your rice allocation or your fuel allocation on a monthly basis, how much of a risk of ghost recipients is there, particularly if you've kind of duplicated the service? So there's an element there. But at the same time, if you are transforming the provision of service, and if you're not just going to go for a universal basic income, but even a universal basic income, you need to know who the people are that you're going to be giving, because you can't just give cash to anybody, because you then come back onto the terrorism funding and other kinds of things. So I suspect the challenge will be to see how these countries adapt their provisions in ways that minimize the fraud risk whilst also allowing the service to be done, because you don't want to put unnecessary constraints on a vital public service.
Mm. I think there is also an interesting question here that Daniel Cabrera has asked around trying to expand this into, he raises the question of opaque organizations, who owns England, and essentially he's saying that the fraud we're talking about here actually is quite micro level fraud, I guess. And are there concerns around the way that rapid changes due to COVID are leading to macro level, large scale organizational fraud, large scale kind of issues where we're seeing changes in policy affecting a kind of a government or large organization level, leading to problems? I'm not sure I expressed that very well. But.
So I suspect that there are. I suspect that a lot of the practice is about the balance between those people who are just keeping, in the old-fashioned metaphor, the lights on and the systems running, and whether there is spare capacity to be thinking about the unintended but possibly quite predictable consequences of that. So at one level, you're already seeing reports that the government is looking to potentially intervene if foreign powers, so not necessarily fraud, but if foreign powers suddenly use the fact that a particular UK-based company, perhaps as part of the critical national infrastructure, is going to be bought out by a foreign power because they're losing money hand over fist. So you are seeing people who are reflecting on that wider unintended consequences kind of issue. And I'm sure that there are people thinking about the kind of broader fraud levels, but I don't know the details of that. I'm much more individually focused at the moment.
Okay, I think we should probably come to a close now and move forward. We've been capturing all the questions, and Wendy's been putting a document together behind the scenes. So we'll definitely share those with Edgar, and we'll try to share them on the website in some way. But Wendy will be feeding them back towards the end anyway. So I'm sorry I didn't get through everybody's questions. They're also available for Edgar to see now. But I think we should move on to our next speaker. So, Marieke, are you ready? Just to introduce you, have you got... So, Marieke, we've known for a while at the LSE. She visited us as a fellow and is based at Warwick Business School. She draws on interdisciplinary perspectives in marketing, particularly online consumer behavior. Her research has focused on collaborative consumption and the sharing economy, and I think that's probably where she's best well known, with her Harvard Business Review article last year, and a lot of work on Uber and the gig economy, and questions around that. And I really wanted to bring her in because I think changes are associated with, firstly, us relying on a lot of people in this gig economy during the lockdown period, but also changes in employment and around surveillance and who you work for and forms of work. I think are really interesting questions for COVID. So I'm really pleased to have you here, and I will hand the floor over to you. Thank you. All right, I'm just going to unmute you. I think you're still muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
See my slides as well?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So yeah, thanks for inviting me. So Will was so kind to ask me or requested me to maybe present some of my research on Uber and algorithmic management. But towards the end of the talk, I would also touch up on more recent research in the context of COVID, which is quite, they're kind of interconnected. And on this slide, I'm listing all my great co-authors. Sorry that I don't have time to read all their names. So yeah. So I'm still based at Warwick Business School until Saturday, and I'm moving to Bentley University as far as COVID allows. So, but today I would like to talk about algorithmic management and app-based surveillance. So, and let's get started straight away. So I think you're all aware of Uber, right? All of you have used Uber. It's a quite well-known brand. And when we talk about Uber or platforms such as Uber, we know that they face a lot of challenges in controlling crowds, right? And crowds in the context of Uber are actually Uber drivers. And that topic has been focused on quite frequently in public media outlets such as the New York Times. So there's this article by Schreiber from 2017. So, and we know that on the one hand, Uber drivers are autonomous, right? So they are officially independent, they are business owners. In most jurisdictions around the world, they are not employed, they're not official employees, they can set their own schedules. And that's of course really good for Uber because they save a lot of money. Right, they do only have to pay Uber drivers for the rides they're actually doing, rather than for time they're just sitting in their cars not being matched to a consumer. So, but on the other hand, that also means that so drivers cannot be forced or delegated to show up at a specific place or time, right? And that is of course a challenge to Uber, because this lack of control has the potential to compromise service quality. They want to offer seamless transportation service, and by not being able to control these drivers, that may be a business challenge for them, right? So what we see is that actually platforms such as Uber implement algorithmic management to manage millions of remote drivers, right? So there are about 3 million Uber drivers worldwide, and they're all managed by the Uber app. And you can see it down there in the pictures. And so what is algorithmic management? So this is our definition. I just copied it in there. So we define it as the collection and use of huge amounts of data, which are then used to improve and develop learning algorithms, and these then take over tasks, right? So coordination and control tasks, which have previously been performed by human managers, and all that happens in a highly automated and data-driven fashion. So this is an ongoing research study, and we started collecting data in 2015. Now we're in the 4th round in a journal, in an IS journal, and so we collected data between 2015 and 2019, and we wanted to really answer the research question how Uber is actually implementing algorithmic management and how that affects platform work. So we use a grounded theory approach here. We have a lot of data covering, different data sources such as interviews. So we talk to the drivers, we observed them. We gathered a lot of forum entries from the uberpeople.net forum, which is a forum where drivers get together and share their experience. And there's selected public dialogue, right? So we have, it's kind of a multi, so there are multiple data sources that we draw on. So what we find is the following. So on the one hand, Uber exhibits a lot of typical characteristics of a marketplace, right? By employing algorithmic matching, right? So there's the Uber platform matching consumers to drivers, right? So that's something that is that's common knowledge, I would say, in IS literature, right? So the IS literature and platform, which has been influenced by economics research, argues that platforms are multi-sided markets and they're marketplaces, right? So the algorithm acts as a marketplace. And so drivers and consumers are matched using sophisticated algorithms, and input and output data is gathered and fed into the algorithms. So output data would be, for instance, performance data, such as reputation scores or reviews that the consumers leave after a ride, right? And then, of course, dynamic pricing is another key element of algorithmic matching, as we know from all kinds of marketplaces. So, for instance, Uber implements surge pricing. So, for instance, I'm not sure if you all know what surge pricing is. Sometimes there is more demand than supply, right? So more people want a ride, but then a lot of people would like to, have a ride, but there are not a lot of drivers around. So surge pricing kicks in, which incentivizes drivers to serve a certain geographical area, and they get more money for a ride. And then platform work, shows also typical characteristics that that previous literature describes in the context of marketplaces, right? So there's autonomy, drivers feel independent, they're self-employed, they're their own boss, it's their own car, they can work whenever they want to. Well, and there's also some uncertainty because they're not officially employed. That means that sometimes they may get jobs and sometimes they don't, right? So there's no certainty. So there's no contractual agreement that they will get rights. Okay, yet we can also see that Uber is much more than just a marketplace, right? Next to algorithmic matching, Uber implements algorithmic control. Right? Why so? Because they want to make sure that there's high service quality that is guaranteed to their consumers, right? So the algorithm also acts as a boss, delegating drivers, forcing drivers to take a certain route, maybe even sometimes deleting or banning drivers from the platform in case they do not behave as desired. Next to input and output data, Uber actually uses a lot of process data, behavioral data, right? So every second, a huge amount of data from each driver is generated, how fast they drive, their GPS location, and so on and so on. And Uber also employs behavioral nudging techniques, meaning that drivers are exposed to certain information, so-called behavioral tricks to make them behave in a desired way without formally forcing them to do certain things. So then we can see actually that on the other hand, platform work is actually characterized by characteristics that are very typical for traditional work environments in organizations, or work environments that are very typical for employees rather than self-employees, right? So they're supervised. There's some repeatability, even though there's no guarantee that they get rides. Some of them have been driving for Uber for a very long time. So there's almost loyalty to the platform, right? So they may have been working for Uber for like 3 or 5 years. And we can also see that they engage in communities. These are informal communities, such as forum communities, where drivers flock together to discuss Uber topics, right? So. Okay, so I've just mentioned that there's algorithmic matching and algorithmic control, and we conceptualize these as 2 aspects of algorithmic management. And you can probably already tell that there are tensions, right? So there are tensions, as also described or mentioned, described in our HBR article that we published last year. There are a lot of tension, and indeed, these constructs that I presented earlier, they are conflicting, right? So if you think about work execution, they are autonomous, but yet they are supervised. You think about the compensation that they get, right? So there's uncertainty, but yet there's repeatability. There's self-identity as being, you know, they feel independent and self-employed, yet they are part of a community. And this has actually been discussed quite intensively in the public media, right? Are drivers employees or self-employees? And we can say that the left-hand side of these tensions is largely overlapping with characteristics that are traditionally discussed in the context of self-employment, and the right-hand side or marketplaces, and the right-hand side more what is traditionally associated with organizations and employment. And actually, I brought you a quote here that's like just an example of our data. So Uber drivers were they really disliked Uber Pool because they had the feeling that they make less money with Uber Pool. That once they you know, they start driving for Uber Pool, they get more and more Uber Pool rides, even though they don't want to. And they actually even called it Uber Pool, right? So showing how much they disliked it. And one of them said, I quote, "Everything changes through the Uber partner app while we drive, forcing us to rearrange everything, including the navigator with one hand still on the wheel," right? So they really have the feeling being delegated, being forced to implement, to do certain things. And if not doing so, being penalized. Okay, and so we see these tensions, and then we also, in our data, also shows that there are certain platform workers' responses. And I don't have a lot of time to go into the details, but I just brought you one example. So that was also featured on the front page of the print version of the Times in 2017 in the UK. And what we find there is that Uber drivers game the system, right? So that's how we framed it initially, because what we find is that they artificially cause surge pricing. They all locked off the app, communicated informally on forums or via WhatsApp, drove into one certain area, and then all switched on the app. All surge pricing only updates every other second, so they got more money for the same ride. So they were gaming the system. However, when we thought more about this gaming behavior, we actually understood that logging in and out of an app, however they please, is actually totally legitimized market-like behavior. So this is what we now conceptualize as one example of market-like behaviors. Anyway, so I mean, so one insight from this Uber case, from our research, is really that algorithmic management, algorithmic control, or app-based surveillance can result in a lot of tensions. If you then think about it, we can really see a lot of overlaps to COVID-19 pandemic public monitoring technologies. such as those COVID apps displayed up there and on the right on the slide, right? So this is actually a project I'm doing with I'm working with two of my colleagues from Warwick Business School, Mo and Jochen, and so we really were interested in tensions that also given, right, so that there are a lot of tension obviously in Uber case. So we're like, okay, what are the tension in the case of these COVID apps, in the PPMTs that are developed these days? And then we find, well, on the one hand, they are super valuable, right? Because they are building blocks of pandemic management, there's high utility. However, they are also threats to users' privacy, right? So there's also tension there. And I think many of you have read the Harari article on whether, you know, these apps kind of help building surveillance states. So that has been discussed quite intensively. So our starting point was that we know that there are tensions, but we do not really know the details. And what we then did is, that's a theory paper. We applied dialectical interrogation, drawing on IS literature, but also on really newspaper articles about latest developments in the PPMT field to articulate and identify as much as 10 tensions. And this is just one that I would like to present. It's just one example, right? So there are conflicting arguments there, and both are legitimate. So if you think about the data scope, or actually how much data is collected by these apps. So on the one hand, you could argue argument A, so to say, as much data as possible should be collected. There should be a lot of comprehensive strategy to data collection. Why so? It allows to to get deep insights into what's going on, to early on identify hotspots, and it's really good. It's kind of helps to fight pandemics, right? However, you could also argue, and that's argument B, no, as little data as possible should be collected, data minimization strategy should be implemented, yeah, only data items that are really immediately necessary should be collected. So this is just one example of a tension. Both are legitimate, and it's just like that in certain countries or systems, argument A is perceived to be more important than other systems or countries, as we can tell from how countries implemented this app. That would be vice versa. These are the 10 tensions we identify. They are all knotted, which means that one tension may influence another tension. So I can't go into the detail, but they are all interrelated and knotted, and taking one side on one tension in one case may affect whether an app that is developed would then also how other tensions are approached and solved. Okay, so these were two, I just presented you two of my research projects, right? So one was empirical, one was theory project, but both of them focus on algorithmic management or app-based surveillance, right? And I just want to reflect on these two projects, and this is my last slide, so I'm almost finished. So so this research shows that algorithmic management and app-based surveillance, or however you want to call it, really has the potential to control crowds, right? And whatever control might mean in certain contexts. There may be a slight control, or there may be a lot of control that is exhibited, right? And you can say that there are a lot of tensions that come up, that arise, right? And that it's really hard to maintain rights. In the context of Uber drivers, it's mainly independence. In the context of the COVID app, it's mainly privacy. So, so really policymakers, companies, platforms, they have to balance a lot of tensions, and some of them may be successful in doing so, and some of them may not be. Generally, I think that these topics, algorithmic management and app-based surveillance, are really huge future topics, because we are going to talk about future IS research, right? So I think they're huge topics in the future in IS research, right? So there's this huge AI and machine learning movement, right? The systems are getting more sophisticated, more and more data is available, more and more people are using smartphones all the time. They already do, right? So I think there are a lot of control issues there, and I think also control needs to be understood much better. So, for instance, I brought you one more example, which is really different from the other two, but it shows you how important this topic is. You think about Facebook, for instance, they always kind of, so they are presenting themselves in the public. They are arguing that they are just a marketplace matching content to consumers without being responsible for the content. But now they're experimenting more and more of how to control content, for instance, by flagging content, flagging fake news, and so on. And we all know that that has been, you know, subject to heated discussions also more lately, over the last couple of years, actually. So there are a lot of issues that will come up in the future. And maybe one very last point, if you think about where the IS field is moving, because we, in this seminar, we're also interested where we're moving in the future. I mean, honestly, I've mentioned that earlier. We started collecting the data for our UBA project in 2015. It's 5 years ago. We're in the 4th round of reviews. Maybe we're lucky and we get into the paper this year. Maybe we're not lucky. But it shows you that there are long processes. And I can see that they're necessary because, you know, you really want to create really great, good quality research, and it needs time. But it also shows us that the world is moving so fast, and maybe IS research is not so innovative after all, right? So, I mean, shorter processes can sometimes be helpful. And so I'm really very pleased to see that there are a lot of special issues now on the COVID topic where journals really promise or try to come up with slimmer processes for short papers, for instance, right? Another thing is the practice relevance. So I think many researchers, we are in an ivory tower, we speak an academic language that is really hard to access by the public. So I must say, I feel like with the UBA paper, we succeeded to communicate with the public by, you know, getting our message, some findings out there in the Times and in HBR. But honestly, I'm working on many other projects and it's much harder to do that, right? So UBA was kind of a hot topic for a while. And but I feel like it's really hard to get this balance between academic research and creating and, you know, really input that is also consumed by the wider public. And but we should try to do that. Okay. I hope we're still on time and many things, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Grace. I think it's absolutely fascinating, and what's really interesting is there's been a kind of side debate going on in the chat, actually by a number of us who were politely listening, but we've seen your presentation before, so if we were listening, but and I think a number of issues arise, particularly when we talk about these large-scale platforms, between what is their role in society, I guess, as a brokerage, as a circle of surveillance and control, and how does that evolve? And I was very interested in that because it goes to the heart of this idea of a platform business. And if I may ask, impolitely, ask my own sort of question, I guess, what's the issue where you have a business like Uber that is extracting surveillance data and that behavioral surplus that Zuboff talks about? Mark's just raised, if people don't know, the platform age of surveillance capitalism, that this is a business that's trying to get rid of itself, of that side of the business. Yay! That essentially Uber is trying to build self-driving cars so that those 3 million drivers are entirely unemployed. and it's using its behavioral surplus from those drivers to do that. Is that something that concerns you? Is that something that is of interest?
Well, I mean, control can also be positive, right? I mean, if you think about it from a theoretical point of view, if you think about fake news, for instance, right? So I can see that sometimes controlling content, for instance, on Facebook, could be something positive. Like sometimes also controlling certain workers so that the platform can make sure that service quality for the consumers is really assured, right? So I think it's about the right balance. And that was the point that I've made earlier, the same with the COVID apps, right? So, I mean, I've heard about a lot of, so these apps then in particular implemented in European countries, but then also the NHS did this U-turn, right? So building on the decentralized system, the Bluetooth system, building on the Apple and Google API innovations that really seeks to value users' privacy, but by also providing a service that can help to fight pandemics. So I think if these tensions are balanced in the right way, control, it has a negative connotation. I think also in the Uber case, it is very extreme. So that's a case where there's a lot of control, maybe too much, but it doesn't mean that it cannot be solved in other contexts. So is that, did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, they're huge issues, aren't they? And we're really getting to the heart of that idea of a digital economy. And we the debate moves on to things of, from literature like 1984 to Brave New Worlds of what is the role of control within our society. And there's an interesting debate that's now happening on the chat around the health apps and whether people understand epidemiological needs for these apps and the balance between the use of surveillance apps in epidemiology versus people's expectations of it. I've just noticed Moni Deepa just posted an interesting study, and they did an experimental study that found people need to be convinced about the societal benefits before they agree to download and use apps. There's apparently a paper forthcoming in DIIESL around this tracking. And I think there are interesting questions about persuading people to join these platforms. What leads people to do this? I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, I think it's so in this COVID-19 theorization of tensions, right? So because we use intellectual interrogation, so we present conflicting arguments. And of course, it's really hard to, sometimes you cannot always balance, right? And meet in the middle. Sometimes you need to make a decision. And we saw it in the case of the NHS. Are you using a decentralized or centralized system? And their arguments speaking for both sides almost, right? Because a centralized system may allow faster access to the data, more data that is available, linking it to NHS data, faster action. While the other one values privacy. So it's really hard because sometimes you cannot balance the tensions, but you need to take a side somehow. And so we saw that the UK made this U-turn, so it's really hard. But yeah, so in case these apps are voluntary, and they're not voluntary in all states, right? So there are some examples, for instance, travelers that come to, that enter certain countries, so they are obliged to use certain monitoring apps in Hong Kong and Singapore, for instance, for a couple of weeks. So if they are voluntary, yes, that goes hand in hand with, privacy concerns. So if you want people to use your app voluntarily, you need to make sure that privacy is valued, that little data is used, maybe that anonymity is assured, and so on. So this is why we're talking about knotted tensions there. But it's not easy, right? And there's not a one-fit-all solution. So it's a constant balancing in the end, or taking a side on the tensions.
Yes, and Edgar's kind of jokingly pointed out of whether or not our adoption and continuance literature in IS has actually managed to address any of this. And there is a lot of suggested reading going through the chat. I raised Monadip. I asked your question, but you said you wanted to raise your hand. Do you want to join the conversation just now?
Yes, could I quickly come in with a couple of observations regarding tensions and to Edgar's point about IS adoption and stuff like that. So one of the challenges we had when doing the study was to not make it sound like a UTaught and TAM kind of study. And so we realized that this is mass acceptance. This is not one person or two people accepting it. And then we figured out from the data that everybody, so to speak to the idea of tensions, everybody doesn't see this issue in the same way. There are people who are very convinced, there are people who are very much against, and there are people in the middle. And so our job was to parse out and unpack these categories and figure out what works for which kind of category. And so I'm happy to share the paper online once it comes in, but the interesting finding we saw was that there were 3 kinds of categories, and each category had different expectations of what they wanted from the app in order for them to sort of download it and agree to use it. And many of them were more convinced about the benefits, and many of them were more convinced about the privacy issues. So there was a definite tension there, as Mariuki mentioned. So I just wanted to make a comment regarding that.
Yeah, that sounds super interesting. I'm looking forward to read that paper. Mm-hmm.
And also comments here around the cultural issues associated with access to this technology. Stephen from BT's asked around sensitivity cultural issues, but also a point out from Edgar from an FT article about, fewer than 70 people in France have actually used it to contact tracing app to report access. There's a lot of issues here, and we probably should move on, but I think there's a real interesting question around IS's as a discipline's part in this debate around contact tracing, or the rapidity of our research, which you've just raised of 5-year publications, but also the problems which Edgar also pointed out of rapid publication in epidemiology leading to poor decisions, which it's a trade-off in the middle of a crisis like this. We need data and we need information, but are we being too slow in responding? Should we be part of the how do we get this app to work? How do we save lives with apps?
So I think definitely I completely agree with this comment. There shouldn't be a rush, right? Accuracy of the data, and it is good quality data, that is super important. But then we also see that sometimes, processes take so long, and there could have been, shorter review processes, for instance. Maybe in the long term, I think that we are moving in academia more towards a practice, in 20 years. I think field will look very different. It will be much more about collaboration with companies, like shorter pieces, more practice-oriented pieces, and it doesn't mean that it's only a good thing, right? So there are challenges come with that as well. But I think the MISQ with the executive, the MISQ executive is, for instance, an example where I think they move a bit faster, and these are shorter pieces. But I would also say that IIS research, it's a poor, sorry to criticize the field, but review process takes so much longer than in management journals, right? 3 times as long, twice as long. Why so? IIS research, innovation, we should be at the forefront, and I think we can just get a bit better about that. And this COVID crisis shows, and I really like how these structures were breaking off by how Mondi, who just made a comment, sorry if I don't pronounce your name properly, Monideepa, that you worked on that, right? And then you produced something that is in these days of high societal relevance. This is so important and should be valued, and so it has advantages and disadvantages, both sides.
I'm very conscious of time, and I want to move on to, I'm sure Mark's presenting some research that I've done with him next, I think, yep. And yeah, which is also long-running research that's gone through a number of review processes. So we definitely feel your pain, as did a number of other people. So Mark, are you ready to take over? Thank you so much. Okay.
Can you see the slides?
Not yet, no.
Right, hang on a second. Okay, hopefully you can see them now.
We can now, yes.
Fantastic. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. And gosh, we've been just having a really, really rich conversation all round, I think. Hopefully some of this will resonate in all sorts of ways. I'm just going to, for those of you who can see me, I'm just going to, obviously becoming a badge of blogging is waving your copy of Zuboff around. So I'm going to wave that there. I wonder how many of us have got right to the end of the 750 pages. So I'm going to talk about zooming in from, if you like, from a national level kind of app and enabling a coordination of distributed actors that Marika was put up on one of her early slides, to looking at a council, a local council's attempt to play a similar kind of brokerage role using digital platforms. It's something that's and keying into what we've just all been talking about. Will and I have been studying Ada and Worthing councils. I'll tell you a little bit more about them in a minute. For about 4 years now. We got through 3 rounds of a major journal and then got booted out at the last minute. So this is work in progress, submitted humbly as that, and I think we've got quite a bit more work to do, but it's quite interesting for its empirical substance. So that's really the main reason that we're bringing this to the table. And we've recently hooked up with Matthew Jones at Cambridge Judge, who's helping to give us a bit more shape to how we kind of how we approach it. So getting into it, I suppose we're attracted, and you can see that there's a couple of people on this, other people on this this seminar who are co-authors in these books. So we just thought we'd bung them up there, but they actually point to some of these kind of the shift in profile that we're seeing in the technology, and there's often a lot of discussion, isn't there, about taking the technology seriously. But I think we would argue, and I think most people would probably agree, that we're witnessing the emergence of more and more of these modular open systems enabling architectures. And I'm not going to bang on about all of these, but we picked out some of the key attributes, if you like, of relevance that we feel to us in our research. We've just been talking, haven't we, about challenging boundedness and stability and kind of shaking things up. So that's kind of interesting. They're generative, so it's important to land some of these, I think. For later discussion. So this notion that people, organizations can take elements of these and bolt them together, the whole API open architecture kind of piece, and make new things. They're modular. I think I've kind of covered that already, and we'll be having a look at some examples of that a bit later. And because of that, some people talk about this notion of combinatorial innovation. So rather than building everything from scratch, increasingly by combining and paying attention to API and open and modular architectures, you can make stuff much more quickly, which speeds up the rate of innovation and of course disruption. We talked about the distributed stakeholders already, so coordination of distributed stakeholders. I think the Uber example is a very nice one of that. But increasingly, I think when we talk about platforms, we're also talking about brokerages and ways of reaching people that are looking a bit different, and including peer-to-peer interaction as well. So enabling, and we'll come on to that in a second, but again, in a public services context, there is a political element to some of this, right? So unless you're very careful, you get co-opted by a Tory conservative view that says, well, if we provide a platform, we can just enable citizens to help themselves. And so what's interesting is negotiating that, because clearly there are some very helpful ways in which, with the right kind of data trusts, etc., citizens can start to help themselves, but without absolving the state for kind of overall care, maybe. And then finally, I think we're all seeing, and this has also been alluded to, blurring the boundaries between suppliers, partners, public, private sector, and we'll look at that a bit later. So given that landscape, I guess we're motivated to ask, well, what sorts of new organizational structures and forms are being created? I popped in a Zittrain quote there, just to kind of to anchor it, if you like, the notion of generativity, and this notion of the kind of implication of a certain type of technology arrangement for practices and organizational structures. So I think we've been talking about sort of various examples of organizing logics of digital innovation and kind of service management and service cultures. unbundling of tech stacks. So the great digital transformation kind of game afoot is really to take your vertically integrated kind of stack and split it apart, so that then that enables you to mix and match some of the components and move more quickly. And if that's the case, and as we'll see, hopefully we'll argue in relation to this evidence, if modular organizations are more inside out and subject to the inertia of their various bits, in other words, if you're an organization that's comprised often of other people's services, which you have bolted together, then innovations in those broader ecosystems start to challenge the way that you're doing your business as well. And so we're kind of interested by this notion of an inside-out organization, in particular what it means for public services, and obviously this notion that they're dynamic and very, very recursively constructed. In other words, you know, a change in one component of a service is likely to trigger changes in other components. Why? Because we haven't yet sorted out open architectures properly, and APIs aren't always that clean, and it's impossible just to change one part of a system without having to reconfigure other bits. So it's very, very dynamically kind of linked. And because of that, I think we're going to try and show that an implication for us as researchers, but also I think for practice as well, is there's much more of there should be more of a focus on the continuous practice, whether we call it innovation or not, and get into that kind of hot territory. We're still debating, but certainly because things are moving more quickly, because things are changing all the time, and we have the ability to put things together creatively, there is more of a focus on the continuous work required to do this, and mashups and DevOps are a kind of example of that. I just wanted quickly to show you a very brief video. So this is contact of mine. It's a different council from the one I'm going to tell you about. You can see, just look at the bit on the left, really. So it was shot last year, but it's an example of how they have, for almost no money at all, put together something that goes around. Basically, they've strapped some cheap Android mobile cameras on the council's refuse trucks, and they've put together a bunch of very cheap cloud-based modular services. So optical character recognition, some signs, so natural language processing, machine learning, so that's the AI, and then some web services to connect to the scheduling app that then tells the trucks where to go and to prioritize different types of potholes. So I'll just play this. You can just see it very quickly. They've also using this technology, this way of bolting together modular cloud-based technology to have a better approach to refuse dumping. So currently it's very expensive because different types of refuse require different responses. So hospital waste, rubble, an old bedstead, and some garden waste require different responses, which are mixed together and cost a lot of money. So by doing this, a similar approach, cheap technology, basically it sorts out the different types of refuses, and it builds an itinerary that then dispatches at the end of the week specific vans to go and put all the stuff together. Quite clever. And those of you watching carefully, it's not entirely finished, it's a beta, but it kind of illustrates the point of where this stuff is going. So on to Adrian Worthing then. So you can see where they are. They're just below London, southwest of London, just down the road from Brighton. So it was a very nice place to go and do research. We literally went and had chips on the beach and did some of our interviewing in the sunshine. And I think they had real problems because their IT had got to an appalling state. You can see that was out for 4 weeks, reverted to paper, and they were just using Gmail to communicate. So that sort of provided a bit of a bedrock for quite a radical approach, a consciously radical approach to redesigning the organization. I'm not going to dwell on the methodology too much, except to say that we deliberately went broad. So we did some snowball sampling. I think bullet point 5, you can see we talked to a number of people, not just in the council, but in the people who we considered were shaping the discourse around technology at the time. So what was going on? This is a shot of a kind of a traditional council, and this goes to my interest in organizations self-understanding changing. So very traditional, a big building, kind of top down, and if you go look inside the council, you can see some silos, can't you? So it was organized into resources and children's and adults and environment, and underneath those there was a lot of duplication. None of the stuff talked to each other, and you had a ton of duplicated waste and functionality, and you could draw that picture for almost all legacy organizations. So that was the problem. what they tried to do is to, and to a certain extent have succeeded, is to rejig that and think, you know what, if we look at adult social care at the top left, or resources, or children's services, if we open those up and you can see the color coding, you can identify a lot of that kind of duplicated stuff. So can we potentially reimagine the council as a set of common capabilities by putting those together? And you can see the platform capabilities box. So in the council, we have to have customer records that we can use to power a number of interactions and payments and forms and reporting, etc. And if we can do that, maybe we can actually reconfigure the council around the citizen and become much more flexible. And this is where they sort of came to. They said, look, you know, actually at the bottom level, this is the kind of DNA of our council. So we're going to start to kind of modularize that, work with outside providers to actually do this and build this. And this is a kind of a view of where they started to get to. I won't dwell on it too long, but I think suffice to say, at the top, you can see the interaction with citizens and businesses at the front end, the kind of publication layer, if you like. And you can see the introduction of Salesforce, Braintree for payments, and a number of other things that aren't shown there. So modular cloud-based services that they're not building themselves, and they're using those increasingly commonly to power a whole load of different products. And at the products layer, the pink bit at the bottom, green bins, refuse, recycling, etc., you can see they're starting to build very, very thin, very simple services which all reuse those common kind of bricks in the center. And the intended result is something like this, of course, which is instead of citizens going to the council and top-down kind of serving people, actually the council is able to enable a much more diverse, I want to use the word ecosystem loosely, but I'm just going to say collection of cross-agency services that come together around a citizen in their front home. So adult social care and healthcare, people coming together, for example, in somebody's home, and to provide a service and share the data that they need. So that's the kind of, that's the model. And I just want to show you just quickly how, some reflections on how that's, they argue at least, that has enabled them most recently during COVID. So I'm going to play you a short video, if it works, in a second, that I scraped off Google this morning. But this is a chap called Paul Brewer, who is the CTO and one of the key drivers in the council. And these are some of the reflections just a bit earlier in the video to the bit I'm going to try and show you. So incredible to see how fast teams have come together. That was raised in one of the earlier presentations, and driven change through so fast. And he's saying there's lots to reflect on that this has happened. The barriers have disappeared. This is fascinating. So he's on the front line, and he's trying to get his head around how this has happened, this increased willingness to do this. So he's developed a platforms for our places strategy, and we knew we had a role as a broker. There were gaps in mutual aid groups. That's what he's going to talk about. So the vital importance of these mutual peer-to-peer helping groups in COVID that were already struggling to organize and wouldn't last too long without a strong organizing force behind it. Basically, because we had a platform in place, we could think about how we create a platform-based digital model, allowing us to generate an understanding of demand and people's requests for support, supply and demand. So this is the point where I'm going to try, and because I'm so bad with QuickTime, I've got to play it and then very quickly get you to the point where they'll need to show, which is 31:57. Here we go. Bear with me. I tried to edit this thing and I just couldn't get it to work. Here we go. I'll play a minute of him. This is Paul.
We were able to think about how do we create a platform-based model, a digital model, which would allow us to generate an understanding of demand or requests for support, how we might generate a way for people to volunteer and for mutual aid groups to come forward as groups, how to facilitate referral into existing community and voluntary sector, design something and launch it quickly, which would allow that activity to happen. So generating requests for support, generating a volunteer base, connecting easily to the existing community and voluntary sector, and treating some well-organised mutual aid groups as organisations to refer cases into. So we built that. We built that in about 48 hours. Like people together, literally building.
So that's that. Generating and connecting, kind of key words there. And the point is, I hope you got that at the end. we built that in 48 hours. So that kind of exemplifies, I think, where I was going. So what we're trying to do with this is we may not continue with it, we'll see, is trying to think about updating Swanson and Rameler, who were talking about capabilities and organizing vision. In other words, evolving technology as a kind of mutuality between these two things. So the capabilities of the technology versus the continual shaping of that vision and the kind of the co-evolving relationship between the two. And I think what we're trying to bring out here is, since 1997, it appears that there is much more opportunity for continual configuration work, as I've tried to kind of argue and present in relation to the literature. And so we're interested in the nature of that continual configuration work. So some of where we're going, how does organizing vision shape the configuration work, and vice versa? A few examples. So there's an example from GDS, Government Digital Service. So we're looking at how the macro level discussions about government technology, we're out there and we're referred to. We showed in the paper how they are referred to by the council. Then the Adrian Worthing program lead, the idea that the council could make available to a platform of capabilities, etc. You've seen evidence of that. We looked at catching the wave. You can see it there. That was the chief executive, and some of the kind of key quotes, phrases from this strategy document, and the Going Local app. And then we talked and we showed that organizing vision, we built that up from talking to this whole group of orange people at the bottom, macro and micro, that I haven't got time to go into now, and then the vice versa. So this notion that actually, as Adrian Worthing were undertaking the configuration practice, they started to change the story in a kind of performative way, in fact. So Matsoft was a kind of low-code platform that they were using, and as they were innovating, they were going back to Matsoft and saying, perhaps you could do this like that, or perhaps you could do it like this. Salesforce in turn, okay, big organization. You can just see the picture there. They're already proudly saying this is how we've done this and how we're changing. The Adrian Worthing CTO trying to kind of build up the kind of story within Adrian Worthing, and then the broader publication of articles, winning awards, and they were going out and persuading other councils like Brighton and Hove, and several others have started this now, and as well as software firms to kind of follow suit. And you know, Adrian Worthing moved to cashless payments, fully cashless, in a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, in the council. That had been resisted for about 5 to 10 years, tooth and nail. So this stuff does seem to be happening. So we tried to kind of bring some of that stuff together, so you can see this kind of focus on unfolding configuration work. And increasingly, we're seeing the council as that. So rather than the collection of buildings or systems, you've got the capabilities on the one side, the cloud-based tech, and you've got the continually evolving organizing vision on the other side. And then somehow this kind of mashup is the new council. And this is what we tried to show, I'm almost done now, in the paper. So showing how, if you start at number 1 at the bottom, the macro level organization vision started to shape the local vision, which shaped the configuration practice, and you guessed it, comes back out into the broader ecosystem. I'm trying to understand that longitudinally. So just to finish off then, I guess we're playing with all sorts of implications. I think, as we've seen, COVID-19 has exposed, I think, organizations' struggles with supply chain and resilience and national infrastructure, and adapting to this rapidly. And I think this case shows how this continual configuration work, enabled by some of the kind of technologies that they put in, enabled them to actually do that in this instance, it appears. And we're interested in some of the political implications of that, and that was actually appeared in, I put that on the chat earlier. You know, if these organizations, and I'm particularly worried about some of them that describe themselves as infrastructure organizations, are kind of taking over and becoming accepted now as part of COVID, because that's accelerated that acceptance process, we need surely to have a discussion about public-private domain. Councils moving towards enabling brokerage models, and they're already talking about local data trusts to enable various people to identify vulnerable and shielded people and go and help them, obviously suitably anonymized, etc. But that raises a whole load of issues. And then more theoretically, I'm kind of interested in the ontology of an inside-out council. You know, this starts to feel very, very different about the sort of organization we're looking at, and how we should address that. It challenges some of the traditional dualisms in research between inside and outside, public-private sector, technology in practice, and of course macro, micro, and I spoke to that a bit earlier. And then finally, I think if this thing is an ongoing focus, then we need to pay more attention, I think, to configuration practice, and also I think, you know, knowledgeably, companies need to deliberately build up kind of more skill sets in doing this. So that was our kind of parting thought. What is it other than a nice beach? Seems to be increasingly a collection of capabilities and vision and ongoing configuration practice. So there we go, that's me.
Thank you, Mark. I'm just going to raise, there was a kind of a very interesting question that was raised by Nigel Melville. He just wrote staff acceptance, question mark, concerns, new capabilities required. And I just wondered, I think that's a really interesting point. And I don't know if you want to talk about that issue of staff acceptance and the role of power here.
Hugely worrying. So hugely worrying, the role of power in obviously this public-private domain issue, the blurring of public and private sector, and Will, you remember when we were there, there was distinct cynicism in people in the contact center who were saying, well, this doesn't replace some of that face-to-face interaction and some of that complexity and what they call the edge cases to this. So I think it absolutely deserves much more critical attention. I'll drop in in the chat afterwards, but I've tried blogging about this and how it starts to kind of reconfigure what maybe a discussion should be about. What's the role of public sector? What's the role of private sector? My own view happens to be that certainly in the UK, there has been an explosion of management and managerial roles in the public sector rather than public servants, doctors, teachers, nurses, social workers, daycare centres, etc. And the real demand, if you like, amongst citizens is for the latter rather than the former. So I think there has been an explosion of managerialism in the public sector as well as the private sector that some of these models challenge. So I don't think it's as simple as kind of public sector good, private sector bad. I think it's about actually a more nuanced discussion about where value for citizens, where public value is generated in the digital era, and how that reconfigures our notion of where we really want to see more public servants as opposed maybe to less. But it's a complicated issue. I
think I also want to bring in a little bit that when we talk about staff resistance, Edgar's raised the issue of vulnerability. Vulnerability is a significant issue. It means different things to different parts of the ecosystem in terms of the duty of care to individuals identified as vulnerable, i.e. by other agencies. And I think what interests me is that in questioning the ontology of this extended organization, of this inside-out organization, which Alan also raises, you start to ask, what are the stakeholders' roles here, and how do we ensure multiple stakeholders from staff to vulnerable people? And that ontology, I think, of the technology is a really interesting point. I was led to just think about Dick Baskerville has written with Michael Myers and Youngjin Yu and MISQ article on ontological reversal of technology, this idea of re-questioning what we think of as technology and as the thing. And I think when you start actually unpicking that further, you start to question about what is the organization. And that kind of links back to the previous presentation where we were talking about Uber and that idea of the organization. So I don't know if you wanted to bring some of those issues together, particularly vulnerable people, the inside-out organization and the idea of it, and how we can address this wider stakeholder group.
I mean, I think I was touching a bit on it, and I won't because it's something we could talk about for a long time, I think. But, you know, accountability, responsibility, governance, standards, those all sound like sort of very hot topics when it comes to platform-based kind of roles, right? The role of the platform. I personally believe that you know, as the kind of data economy takes off, that the government has to start moving towards that kind of role, because if they don't, of course, technology is getting democratized as well. So I showed you that Swindon example. That cost a few £100 to put together. And people are going to start kind of doing that themselves and then saying, what's my council for? So there's a legitimacy question as well. So I think we have to grapple with these things. But I do think it's, you know, an accountability and responsibility. You know, politicians shouldn't get let off it, and it shouldn't become a Tory, a sort of conservative or right-wing type of SOP, because it, you know, that would be completely to miss the point. So it does seem to me that those of us who are interested in these and reasonably literate in these topics have a vital role, I think, to try and push this level of discussion, because we've got people represented from all sorts of nationalities here this afternoon. It'd be interesting to do a kind of 1 to 5 poll as to how engaged people think their politicians are with the kind of issues we're discussing in this discussion now. Really.
And interestingly, I'm going to ask Rosa's question in a second, but interestingly, we have a debate in the UK where people were pushing against a government-led app for COVID because of surveillance issues, and demanding an app led by Apple and Google, who are instead. There is a kind of interesting tension. I know there were technical issues around it, but there is an interesting tension of who are the harbingers of our society, and what's the role of government as a thing within this broader ecosystem. However, sorry, I'm just talking. Rosa Prajadas at the LSE asked, when you talk about capabilities, it sounds like empirically you're focused on technological capabilities. How do these relate to various services offered so that it becomes citizen-centric?
So we're already, interestingly, Rosie, you're pushing on a weak point there, because one of the reviewers hated our treatment of capabilities. So that's really insightful. Maybe it was you. Maybe you were the reviewer. So yes, I think we have too naively looked at technology and capabilities. I mean, it's hard to do this without tying oneself up in knots, depending which literature tribe one belongs to, I guess. But kind of, with the servitization of technology, and this idea, in fact, that you just rent this stuff by the hour, utility technology, then obviously we have to worry less about the technology services and the technology itself, and more about the services. And I think personally, that's probably a good thing. The problem is we totally lack the infrastructure and the kind of boundaries to have a sensible discussion about how some of those models in the private sector translate over to public services, because people who use public services don't have a choice. They're not consumers, and they're often the most vulnerable. So I just think we are woefully immature in this discussion at the moment.
Yeah. Monadeepa, I'm not sure if I pronounced your name correctly, but I think she raises the quite clear point of the NHS app was collecting that data and storing it centrally, whereas the Google and Apple are doing this on the phone. Apparently, they're not storing the data centrally, which I thought were really interesting architectural debates around what the app was for and what it wasn't for, and raising this issue of the government again and its role within it. Epidemiologists, if asked, I think I was probably more in favor of an architecture of centrality, because you can change the way that you're looking at things, and you can work out that people are sat in a traffic jam in different cars versus people in different places, and you can change your modeling. But there was clearly something there that people did not trust the idea of the government having some central big app. And Edgar would be an interesting one to bring in on that, with his identity work and his challenging of the identity card. But there's a bigger debate to be had. I'm conscious of the queue. Oh, and Rosette's obviously claiming that she wasn't the reviewer there on the chat.
Don't believe you.
We don't believe a word of it. But anyway, I'm conscious of time. Mark, do you want to say anything, or should we break? We're already 10 minutes over. I hope everyone feels they're being, that I'm reflecting their views correctly. Feel free to complain like crazy if I haven't addressed your question, or if you want me to ask it or raise it so that you can ask your questions. But we're going to break now for nearly an hour, for 50 minutes. So the idea is that we come back, remind me of the time, I'm just looking at trying to find my thing. It is 3:30, isn't it? We start again. Mark, you can I'm sorry, I've got so many.
Yes.
So we start again at 3:30 in 1 hour, 50 minutes time. That gives everyone a chance to just stretch their legs and their eyes and pause for a second, and then we can just reconvene then. So I'm really pleased. We've had a phenomenal number of people. We nearly had as many people as somebody raised earlier have used the French reporting app to report COVID cases. So we have had nearly as many on this app. on this call. So we will see everybody else again at 3:30 on the same link on the same service. Thank you.
Okay.
We'll just give it a minute, Michael, just
Sure.
Just sweeping up. So
I'm just trying to. Oh, okay, good. Just checking that it takes a little bit of a lag between. So there you are. I think. Are you seeing the full screen?
We've seen Business School, yes.
Okay, fantastic. It probably looks like that today, although I haven't seen it for 3 months or more.
Nice to see the old place.
Yeah. Oh dear. Yeah. Now, where are you? Oh, I guess you're all at your respective homes. You haven't gone in yet, have you, Mark or Will? No, not for you. No.
No. Someone just sent me a Matt cartoon, though, of someone shuffling their way into the office saying, "I've only come into the office for the air conditioning. I can't sleep at home," which I thought was nicely put. Are you ready? Should I kick off and just introduce?
Sure. Yeah.
So for anyone who didn't join us earlier, the aim of these sessions is we're launching DIIESL, which is a new set of seminars which are ostensibly based around institutions vaguely connected with London, but it's essentially a new seminar series looking at digital innovation, interfacing, I think, an economy. I've forgotten what the innovation and economy, and that's the idea of the series, which I should remember the name of. What we're bringing together today was a bunch of people to talk about COVID and how it might affect the future of digital innovation research. And I was really keen to get Michael involved, particularly from a practice-based theory. His work has ostensibly looked at practice-based theory, and this question of practice is clearly part of it. Michael's looked at service innovation, ecosystem leadership, digital innovation, and co-working spaces, platform ecosystems, AI, and has focused on the healthcare, fintech, energy, etc. Very widely published. And I've known him, we've worked together and known him for a long time. Just to remind people, questions, if you post them on the group chat, if it's anything like the previous session, there'll be a rampant set of discussions going on the group chat, so keep that open and ask questions there. I'd like people to mute themselves, and I'll call on people if I want them to join with audio, otherwise I'll hand over to Michael. Thank you, Michael.
Yes, and thank you, Will and Mark and all the other organizers for putting this together, and indeed for having me come a bit later, which scheduling wise was difficult to come a little earlier. I love the name, by the way, Will and Mark. It sounds like an engine, DIIESL, and it's got lots of energy already behind it from what you've shared. And indeed, as you mentioned, the theme struck a chord when you asked if I'd say a few words about research in this area, particularly where we are now in terms of COVID and just the run up to COVID, actually. And so I've titled it the presentation Why, and I've done a bit of a play on the words there, IS, why is practice essential for digital innovation research? And this is even just pre-COVID, it's been something which has been a number of people have raised with me and many others. So I've been sort of puzzled by these two issues, which I thought I would use to just guide some thoughts. I haven't got any big results. It's not a big study I'm presenting. It's just some reflections, really. The question usually posed is that given the nature of platforms, you've heard from Marika and others on the way in which they span time and space, and the way in which it's an incredibly interesting, rich phenomenon, and the extent to which practice theory, as it's at least has traditionally been used, is still relevant and useful. in studying these emerging contemporary and digital phenomena with those characteristics that I just mentioned. And so the whole idea of the extent to which one can start to gather some interesting evidence, I'm calling it, but it's really just some preliminary insights over the last few months. Actually, I decided I would do something which was new, or something that I'm sort of playing around with just in the last couple of months since COVID. And so there's a couple of research projects that would give you just some very, not even just a few interviews, but just to share with you what I'm thinking about with respect to this question. By the way, just to give you, just in case you nod off or you have to leave, the answer to that question is a definitive yes, that today practice theory is even more important. Might seem counterintuitive to some, but with a big data and a digital pervasiveness in our world, it's incredibly important. And I think we've all seen that in different ways, which I hope to point out shortly. But before I do that, just a quick trip down memory lane, as I call it. Over a quarter of a century, my first project actually, looking at the London insurance market and the use of IT and work transformation, and it wasn't called digital at that time, but certainly IT and innovation were key themes. The reason I bring it back briefly is that the context of that study was in the aftermath of a crisis in the 1990s. It wasn't a pandemic, as we know, COVID-19, but it was certainly a massive financial reinsurance crisis following a wave of different natural disasters, from hurricanes, earthquakes, and the like. Unprecedented was a word that was used then as well, in a different way. And at the same time, we saw a massive growth in ICTs being used for placement at a distance. We also saw, even then, lots of new algorithms that were being developed to price insurance that was starting to threaten the traditional underwriting practices that were happening around the Lloyd's of London. And so when you think of also what else was happening, there was the emergence and birth of new insurance markets in different places like Bermuda, which are big markets today. And they leveraged the use of IT to enable risk placement. They were using many different pricing new models, which were pooh-hooed and refuted as being valuable in more traditional markets, such as Lloyd's, in the pricing of risk. And to investigate that, even back then, involved myself conducting over a 5-year period an ethnographic practice-based study in how London sought to develop their electronic trading, especially around risk support systems at the front end. So the picture there showing the broker and the underwriter and that exchange. Well, yes, indeed, things have moved on significantly in terms of the technologies and the pervasiveness of the ICTs and digital technologies. But I want to argue that indeed, whilst we need to be inclusive and pluralistic and really think about how we work together with multiple different approaches, practice perspective is indeed extremely important. Even for that study, the whole idea of the research questions were, is Lloyd's as a physical place still needed in a high-tech world of insurance? Are its practices obsolete with digital? They might resonate today in very much the same way contemporarily. How do we adopt and use IT to support a highly innovative yet traditional old-fashioned market? And indeed, without going into any detail at all, the idea of how could we develop and theorize from a practice-based approach, drawing on, in this case, a practice theorist, Anthony Giddens, and his late modernity ideas, very much looked at the importance of the intimate interrelationship of the globalizing tendencies, as he calls it, of institutional change with what's happening at the identity level of the individual, the broker and the underwriter, the questioning of what are their practices and who are they in this new emerging brave world. And so briefly,
Michael, we're not seeing your slides change. I don't know if your slides are changing.
Shoot. I'm so sorry. Thank you for saying something. Well, okay.
It was a brilliant introduction. I thought you yeah.
Apologies, everyone. So there you go. So that I just finished there, just saying, just to keep on train, you know, the practice approaches and very relevant for what we see with this emerging marketplace becoming more digitally influenced. And so the whole idea of how do we think about, you know, whether or not and how practice approaches are relevant in an increasingly pervasive digitized world. Indeed, I would suggest offers a lot of reflection, and indeed Wanda and many others have highlighted the way in which we need to think about the distinction. Of course, they're overlapping, empirical, theoretical, and ontological aspects of practice. And if I was to consider, you know, at that point in time, many years ago, the idea of emphasizing the empirical at the top column or row, very much an ethnography, as I mentioned, on financial markets, the use of practice theory around Giddens, a bit more silent on bringing out explicitly what the ontology of a practice approach was. But and then the rows that follow down are simply to highlight what I think all of us in our reflexive mode as researchers engage with over time, where depending on the phenomenon, depending on one's insight or conversations that one is joining, the way in which different theories, practice theories, are drawn on. So you'll see the second row, practice lens of Olakovsky, Reckwitz with a wider view of practice, taking into account affect and emotion. Barnes with his notion of social practices, really helping to try to understand some of the phenomena which went on with colleagues to look at, in this case with Eva Oborn and Elizabeth Davidson, the whole idea of multidisciplinary healthcare practices and how technology, particularly on EHRs for specialist cancer care, can enable ways of working in new ways. And then some later work, which I won't go through, but the whole materiality of practice, the work with, a very important work with Wenders on the CERN physicists, and looking at how we can understand digital coordination. These are all examples of how one can see that it's, what are you front stage and what are you backstage, and where are the interesting, important elements of practice theory that may be relevant for a particular phenomenon. And still, I'm going to suggest in the last row, very valuable and important in areas such as the last talk I understand was on platform businesses, the whole idea of work that we've done on mobile money, 3D printing with Stavros Polikarpou, and indeed I would say it's become, and I want to show a little bit, very important for a post-COVID era that we examine and take even more note of the spatial and temporal aspects of practice, and under what we've referred to in some of the work of trajectories of innovation. So just to sum up there, before getting into some of the recent work, I want to just emphasize that all of us, and I try to show myself included there in earlier work, have to ask some reflexive questions as we go along, and we do often, whether explicitly or not. What's been my or our approach to practice-based research? What are my blind spots? What might we front stage or sharpen or develop as practice-based research to investigate emerging phenomena with their distinctiveness in contemporary digital life and business? These are some of the things that I want to just explore now and suggest why the practice lens is indeed extremely valuable and fruitful going forward. So, going back to an earlier, you didn't see the slide because I hadn't moved it forward in time, and Will prompted me. But indeed, the one I wanted to look at briefly is some work that on telemedicine, and the other one looking at just some of the tackling of COVID that we've seen around recently. We've all sort of, by osmosis, or all these briefings that have just come to a close, have kept us informed of on a daily basis. So what is how can we think about this issue of practice being relevant today through these two areas? My first engagement in research actually in telemedicine was with Panos Konstantinides, where I can still remember driving around Crete in the mountains. So fieldwork has its benefits. Looking at clinics in Crete that were doing telemedicine and teleconsultations with specialist hospitals in Heraclion, which is the capital, and indeed that would reflect the bottom of these schematics, which we're sort of looking at a very traditional, whether it's a clinic to a specialist hospital or a hospital to community home care. the whole idea of telemedicine, even I would say right up into pre-COVID, very much had that as the only tenor. That would be the way in which the vast majority of uses of telemedicine were seen. What we have seen is, in the UK, rapid, as we know, adoption of teleconsultation, from 10% of GPs using it to 80% adoption in 1 month. And so, yes, indeed, one would say with the pandemic, necessities of other invention, the need for contactless kinds of support to access, the only way to access patients really did drive a radical increase, both in terms of speed, but also the delivery and adoption of telemedicine. But if we also look at some work that we're just starting to look at in Israel with Sheba Hospital, where there's 2 other configurations which are fascinating, which have only started in the last 6 to 8 weeks. And they refer to them as the sort of outpatient intermediate kind of a setting, as well as, amazingly, how telemedicine is happening within the hospital itself. Let's look at them together. So here you've got the first picture, which is highlighting the very much the control system, the laptop simply being used. That's straightforward, as I've discussed with teleconsultations here in the UK, patient at home, the doctor in the hospital. And that's been very much more restricted, the focus of it helping to support the diagnosis of healthcare management. But let's look at some other very interesting spatial configurations and how they're changing. This is the left-hand side of your picture is inside a teletent, as it's called. Very interesting words. The metaphors are important. During this very much a temporary space that actually is sitting literally outside, just outside the hospital, but on the hospital compound. And it has a command and control center, but it's very much in a separate building. It's, like a field hospital, if you like, doing battle with COVID. Then the war analogy, very strong there indeed. And indeed, what they do is, how is it different as well, is that it's bringing in multiple disciplines that are allowing for, whether it's internal medicine people, general medicine, counselors, all different parts of the care process that people are affected through COVID are being supported through this new temporary space. And so in some ways it's fascinating because it is a required, as crises do, radical reframing of traditional telemedicine with new temporal and spatial configurations that mean that practice approaches are incredibly important to understand how this delivery of care is happening. Even now, this is inside the hospital. So now we're looking at 3 different situations. The first to the left is, again, in the hospital where people are sitting behind their computers. What you see in front there looks like a plastic, but it is actually a glass sheet. It's very much separating the person doing telemedicine with the intensive care area, separated by this glass sheet. And so interesting how the same space gets divided. The control is there by the physicians. You can supervise and see both visually, but also telemedicine. The second picture shows the use of robots. So the idea of how robotics can help with moving between different ward beds. And indeed, increased digitization has started to escalate in terms of how to manage this very difficult situation. And in the third picture, we see that all the PPE is appropriately on. We see the way in which many different types of technologies are being used. In fact, there's what's called an early sense technology underneath the bed, which tracks all the vital signs and monitors and allows for ways of being able to manage the care. So just a short, small example of how what we're seeing is you've got lots more robots, you've got more sensing, lots of data being collected from that sensory information, but also very much a radical shift in the different temporal and spatial relations by which care is being provided through new ways of delivering and using telemedicine in conducting contactless care. And of course, my point in the middle there is to say that what we're doing right now is another radical way in which we've all experienced, whether it's online teaching or ways of connecting into different research seminars, is another great example of how digital technologies are playing an even greater role, very much so, in how practices that we've traditionally done are being enacted, and requiring one to really examine those alongside the technology in an important and refreshing way. I wanted to give one other example, which we're all familiar with, which I think is fascinating to sort of more as at this point, I hope to study it more of an armchair observation, because we live it, and we've been living it for 3 months. The whole idea of how we've tackled COVID-19, the whole idea that COVID is a global pandemic, as we've said, very much in and over time and place, very much implemented, as we know, differently across different countries, different locales and places, over time, changing as well. So in the UK, briefly, as most of us may know, but not all, because we're global in our constitution, I believe, we've had very much a big science led with big data initially, with a focus on how can we flatten the curve, check the R and recheck it, and have all the computational analysis, which is absolutely important, but which certainly did predominate perhaps some of the reflective thinking that might have gone alongside the grounded practices that needed to be observed and needed to be reconfigured temporally and spatially as we went along. And indeed, we do see that all the things that we're familiar with, regardless of where we are in the world, the social distancing, the lockdown, the isolation, and etc. But it is important to recognize that, that in different places, such as in this case South Korea, very, very different way of approaching it. No lockdown practices, but at the same time, amazing different uses of technology for tracking. With some of which would not be done in every place, but it's the rapid communication of the information, the massive testing that was done early on, different practices and different ways of addressing the same phenomenon, but very much a commingling of the practice and their enactment over time with the use of technology, producing a different trajectory of the innovation than perhaps what you might see in the UK. I just want to bring out from this, because of time, that indeed I talked a little bit about the UK, but the whole idea of how one does contact tracing and the extent to which it's different in every jurisdiction, how many flip-flops have happened by different countries adopting more of a decentralized mode over time, starting with a centralized mode, ourselves included, the way in which you have competing regimes of technology, so Apple and Google together rather than government. So what we're seeing is the importance very much of how the sort of geopolitical and the challenges of public-private partnering around the technology implementation being very important, alongside the privacy preservation challenges or approaches differing from different locale to different locale over time. And indeed, taking a practice approach, many of these are unintended consequences of trying them out on the ground, whether it's the Isle of Wight, which never happened very well to date, or the extent to which we're seeing the importance of seeing to what extent Bluetooth as a technology used, as we know, for pairing for music, maybe, or to our TV, to what extent and how it might be used or not used effectively in things like contact tracing apps. And so the idea of social materiality is still extremely important in how we start to explore some of these issues in ways that require and demand a good focus on a practice approach. Just a little bit back to, I found this really fascinating, the sort of geopolitics that we're in, the sort of big tech versus government. Mark, I think, will have a lot more than I could ever think or say on this topic. But this quote is, I think, very classic in the way in which it's not, as usual, very outward-facing by many governments, but the digital minister of France highlighting the need for collaboration and community, which wasn't seen to be there to fight the crisis, and the extent to which this is a a power, of course it is a power struggle, and positioning economically, highlighting that there are a number of both economic as well as health and public health issues which are being looked at with this pandemic. So just one last point I wanted to make on the contact tracing idea is the lovely quote here. This is from a conference in Boston, Impact, which is highlighting that the initially very tech happy focus on the apps, which are still could be very helpful and important, but again, perhaps sometimes an over dependence on how they might help with the contact tracing as a practice, and showing that indeed, in addition to the technological components, we need to have process boots on the ground that are needed to make sure that actual human connections happen and engagement takes place, providing the necessary guidance and support. And that only by studying and understanding how people are using or not using the different apps, that the tracing practices are going to be very different, or they're going to be very useful or not very useful, depending on how follow-up is done with tracing and how disciplined people are in being motivated and incentivized to help their fellow person in the event of an infection. So a few concluding thoughts. Key point that practice-based research from those two observations of looking at telemedicine and then COVID-19, highlighting that indeed the conditions, practice, and consequences on the ground are absolutely critical, even more critical with contemporary digital phenomena. I want to say at the same time that very much requires looking at actively working with different approaches, including computational social science, to see how the practice perspective can be scaled and used in new ways, so as to have its full effect in being able to arrest and understand the phenomena that we're trying to investigate in the contemporary digital age. So just to highlight the last point, that this means that we all have to be ongoing reflective in our thinking ontologically, theoretically, and empirically of how we adopt and use a practice approach. And I'm going to suggest that there's increasingly and more explicit consideration needed of temporal and spatial relations in today's contemporary digital phenomena, as I think we've seen just with those two examples of telemedicine and COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. There's been a number of questions just coming through, so I'll read a few out and we can just take some of them in order. Then I have one of my own. So Mark's been kind of wading in, saying interesting point, Michael, regarding the tech spending and the support of practices, and of course perhaps accelerating the evolution of the practices themselves, which includes work on digital councils. I just wondered, and I suppose he's going on about tech-driven scientists towards the tech and politicians following the science, and I think
yes.
And I wondered, and I wanted to kind of hook that a little bit into the practice-based research methods, and how are we quick in the data scientists are very quick in producing correlations, which then immediately turn into causality, which leads to policy decision making, whereas practice then leads to being very slow and almost like we're putting the sand in the cogs of their finely tuned machines. I read a beautiful article about how inside buses, the metal inside the bus will obviously focus the Bluetooth waves, suggesting that you may be sat next to someone when you haven't been anywhere near them, just because you're stood in a metal box that's reflecting radio waves. They're based findings which don't exist when we deal with people as dots and networks.
No, brilliant. Exactly right. I mean, I fully agree with you on the latter there, and certainly on the former. I don't want anybody to leave thinking that I'm suggesting that there isn't a role at all for computational social science and data. Indeed, it's very critical. It's how we work and commingle together. if either party doesn't tango with the other. So as I think we've seen with some COVID-19, where there's a overemphasis, if you like, of trying to get the right model, and they are at the expense of seeing how we work with that on the ground enough, of course. And I think we've done a much better job in the last several weeks. But it's easy to be blinded, regardless of your perspective. It's easy for me as a practice researcher to be blinded to say that there isn't a rule. That's absolutely rubbish. There is, as you said, Will, the need for how we can work with and get information that will help to fuel our understanding of the phenomenon on the ground with data sensitive and data rich and very, very quick and speedy and scalable ideas is absolutely essential. And at the same time, we need, on the other hand, for data scientists, computational social science to also see how to work effectively with a recognition of practices, and as Mark said, the evolution of the practices, which can only be seen as one studies in vivo.
Just following on in a way, Rosa Pajadas again, Rosa at the LSE, asked about telemedicine, configuring the space of telemedicine. She asks, I wonder if you have explored the creation of global teams of medical staff. How frequent are these? And what are the main barriers? And might I add also, what are the main barriers to researching this practice when it is distributed and hidden in people working in different places?
Yeah. And the latter is difficult, but that's the nature of the phenomenon. The good question, Rosa. Hi again. Yes, it is configuring the space, and we can learn a lot from global teams that are looking at this phenomenon. In fact, that's the reason why we've just started through CDI, Cambridge Digital Innovation, a consortium of research groups, Canada, Sweden, Germany, and Israel, to really look at these different sets of practices. It's the only way that we can do is have people on the ground that are culturally knowledgeable of how our medical practices are unfolding, the different technologies that are being used, and to find ways as researchers to work with actively, and that's what we're planning and are starting to do with these hospitals that are often also globally connected, to help in that connection and sharing and of interesting and new practices on an ongoing basis, so that we can be more effective and useful in how our findings are having a wider and more effective impact. So that kind of tries to start to answer your question there. The constitution of the teams is very important as well. So how are we going to be working with different skill sets of people that are more quantitatively providing the computational social science alongside what we focus on, and doing it not just as a side by side, but finding ways as to how we might commingle that in ways that are appropriate.
Mm. There's you can probably see it yourself, but there's an interesting debate between kind of Edgar and Mark around the contact tracing app. But I just want to pull out Beth Kuehl, who says current government response fit into a historical pattern of responses to tragedies, focusing on using discoursal practices to de-amplify public anxiety about health risks. And I think there's a really interesting narrative and discursive idea going on here. How do we explore these narratives around persuading the population that we are improving, or that these apps will make things better, and addressing the failure, essential failure of most technology when thrown into this type of context?
Yeah, I think that, and it's a responsibility I think we increasingly need to have a voice to do, in terms of how do we both alert and make sense of the narratives that are emerging, and the way in which we've seen over time many different ways of amplifying and future possibilities that don't often necessarily, they never unfold as their vision, but how do we help with both government and the people that are front stage? I guess we should be on some of those TV programs there, right, at night to talk alongside the CMOs and the CIOs, both the Chief Information and Innovation Officers within the hospitals, as well as government, So incredibly important point, and something which, you know, that is how we need to be reflecting the futures, the digital futures in our research.
Yeah, and Mark and I have been talking quite a bit about narrative work and the way that vision is needed. I mean, if any app is going to succeed, then the worst thing we can do for it at the moment, I would imagine, is have long debates about the success and failure, or otherwise just as within the public domain around these privacy issues, etc. I think that's probably what may have damaged it. This is just kind of speculation rather than otherwise. But yeah, I'm conscious of time, but I just wanted to pull you in a slightly different direction, Michael. I'm just going to step away from the questioning a little bit more of this. Bert Swanson wrote the paper on arguing that technology is routine capability and trying to drive forward an idea of what is technology within practice. And your work here has talked about this extended ideas of practice and the entwining of the technology with that within the practice. And when the practice is now being much more mediated by these extended networks, we've got 50-odd people sat in front of various different screens around the world, looking into various different cameras, coming together to form this seminar. What is technology and practice to you? How does that work in this strange post-COVID world?
Well, I guess two things just to pull out again. As you said, the intertwining is just of a scale that we haven't experienced as researchers in quite the same way. I know some people have been perhaps doing much more of it before COVID, but we're all experiencing very, very quickly. So temporality and temporal rhythms is really important as to understanding the dynamism of the change. We need to account for that. We need to account for whatever label we want to use, but what is this technology, the more materially enacted, mediated type of practice, and how do we understand it? As we know, there are many labels, whether it's from socio-technical to socio-material to different theories, ANT. So there are many, many different ways one could try to understand this. It's not going away. I think it's suggesting that by looking at the radical nature of speed and temporality along with spatiality are going to be critical in how we use those insights and ideas in our investigations, of socio-materiality more generally defined. So I don't have a full answer for you at all, of course, but I think that it just highlights the, what do you look for, what do you foreground, and what do you try to then understand about the phenomenon to be able to make sense and theorize about it. And we can't just plod the same old ways of how we've looked at practice. We need to recognize the fundamentals and the premises and the tenets, but also recognize how those are evolving and need to be foregrounding of certain aspects which represent or which are constitutive really of what we're going through in contemporary digital phenomena.
Thank you. I'm going to stop there because I'm doing a very bad job of chairing and we need to move very quickly on to Francois Xavier. Are you ready, Francois? I should apologize. Francois Xavier said much earlier that he has to leave at 4:22, which is fine. We've still got plenty of time for his conversation. But if the questions extend beyond that, we'll take the questions and we'll feed them back to you afterwards. So we'll absolutely keep you in turn. But I will shut up now and stop wasting your time. But thank you, Michael. Phenomenal conversation. I think there's lots of interesting themes that we've connected to.
Thank you very much. Very much. It was great to be here, and I'll be continuing and looking forward to Francois' talk now. I'll stop sharing.
And Francois looks at a lot of these issues. You maybe I just briefly introduce him. You looked at the emergence and legitimization of digital innovations and new forms of work. You're writing a book that you should introduce to us that's coming out in the summer, which is fascinating, looking back at the 1940s crisis and bringing it forward. So spot on for today's conversation. Thank you. We can see your screen.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Thank you again, Will, for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here today and meet again a couple of colleagues I've not met for a long time. For other colleagues, I think I met them 1 hour ago. Some people I see in the loop of the Zoom. So I'm very happy to be here. It's not a traditional presentation I will do. It's more a teaser about a book which will be published in October in French of this year and in English at the beginning of next year. And a book which is based on my sabbatical at NYU. And as you will see, I will raise more questions than answer. I don't want to say too much about the book itself, in particular because it's not been published yet. But the topic is the birth of digitality and the computing for a world in crisis in the 40s. And of course, there are very interesting parallels to draw between the COVID crisis and World War II, which is at the heart of this book. And I will try to draw some parallels. So the beginning of this research, it's something which I saw as kind of a gap in the literature. I think there are a lot of historiographies about management. There are a lot of historiographies about digitality, but there are very few historiography in the middle. Historiography, I mean long-term perspective on the common history between management as an institution. You will see that what I've tried to explore, it's management as an institution, and digitality. And you will see by digitality, I mean not just techniques, but also a philosophy. So 3 years ago, which means before my sabbatical, I started collecting some data. I started to look before the sabbatical at some archives, and I will give some details about these archives, to elaborate an integrated story about the joint history of management and digitality, with a focus on a specific period, 1939-1949. So it includes World War II, but also a little bit what happened just after World War II. And of course, a specific place, which in my book becomes an actor. It's the city of New York itself, which played a very important role in the encounter between management and digitality. I was able to discover that all major dates about the beginning of management as an institution are related to New York. It was a big surprise for me in the exploration of this archive. So in the context of this sabbatical, started in August of last year, I had the opportunity to analyze further some data that I already collected, to collect some new ones in New York. Thanks a lot to NYU and Bob's library for the precious support. It's been very helpful. And I had the opportunity to finish a book that I delivered in late April. So the thesis I tried to, I think almost everything is on this slide about what I tried to show with this book. My thesis is that management and digitality have met in the context of World War II. I mean, management as a global institution and digitality as something in the middle of a technique and a philosophy. They have met in the context of World War II. And they have constituted a new temporal regime, which has been dominant till the 90s. And I'm not very original in the way I label this temporal regime. I call it presentism. And this presentist temporal regime is still part of our world. It is evolving since the late 90s, and I will explain why this is an important pivot for my story. And what is interesting when we tell the story this way of an encounter between management and digitality with an imprint, it's that it makes sense, I think, of a lot of political problems that we have to cope with today. In particular, this issue of building new commons in our society, new ways to be or to act together. And I think if we look at this old story, there are many things that we understand. And then the COVID crisis is just an epiphenomenon that makes visible or sensible something that started to happen before. In this story, and this is part of course, of the book, I did my best to include what was happening. It was an immediate history when I delivered the book. But the COVID crisis is just something that makes visible something. I had the opportunity in another book published in 2015 already to study one leg of my story, one part of my story, the Macy conferences, which took place in New York, first in 1942, and then as a cycle between 1946 and 1953. And you all know how important they are for computer history and the history of digitality. I think it's a beautiful window to look at a story. I'm not claiming that this is the space and time where digitality was invented. I'm just claiming that this is one of the most powerful windows to look at the birth of digitality, because all the main actors involved in the birth of digitality, they were in a way or another at the Big Man Hotel at that time, so the place where the conference took place. All the most brilliant people of that time, Shannon, von Neumann, and so on, they attended the Macy conferences, and all the pieces that are part of digitality till today, they were part of the discussion. And administrative sciences were part of the discussion. So let me say a few words about digitality as part of my story in the 40s. And then I will try to include in my story, in the second part, management. We try to tell a different story. So Macy conferences are already largely explored in media studies, MIS research, computer sciences. Most of the time, the three sources that are used are on this slide. Steve Himes, who co-edited, re-edited very interesting proceedings of this conference, Jean-Pierre Dupuis, and of course, Catherine Els, who is also part of the socio-material debate, the post-human debate that we know in MIS research. To make it short, there are three key ideas that I can summarize based on these previous publications and data. First, is that what happened in the context of the Macy conference, it's also an utopia, the explicitation of an utopia. We don't want anymore to live these awful things. Almost all the participants to these conferences were either soldiers who suffered physically from World War II or people, Jewish people who went to Nazi camps. So World War II was a trauma shared by almost all the participants to this conference. And neglecting this embodied aspect of the conference, I think it's missing a very important thing. So they were dreaming of a different world, a peaceful world. And their rationalistic vision of the world was also a very peaceful vision. The other thing that I found interesting is that in most of the discussion, when they talk about digitality, and this is the word that they used, digitality, digital. It's not a recent consulting stuff. It's the very word that they used. What I found very interesting is that it's not really a technique. It's not really a philosophy. It's something in the middle. I suggest to call, based on Peirce, a semiosis, which means both a way to act upon the world and at the same time a way to make sense of the world. And I call this digital semiosis. And first, this semiosis in the 40s and 50s has been a very material thing. You know what were computers of that time, very material things, black boxes by and for experts. And then at some point, it was more a process. I think today, digitality, the way these people would have defined it, today it's much more a process of materialization, rematerialization of the world. Our tablets, smartphones, our gestures, movements, continuously materializing, rematerializing, a way to pay something, a way to geolocalize something. It's more a process. So I go quickly on this because it's very well-known things about this first leg and digitality as visible and emergent in the 40s. You all know these three key pieces that also appear in the proceedings of the Macy conferences. First, information as a signal between a transmitter and a receiver. a very physical, electrical flow. Second conceptual block, something likely to have a value related to a probability of occurrence. Of course, you all know that block 1 and block 2 are based on Shannon writing. And of course, there is the third and last block, which needs the two previous ones to work and to become effective. The binary vision, mathematical vision, which is behind the two blocks. It's the logical automata as presented by Fonneman for the first time in the context of the Macy conferences. So, till now, I've not mentioned at all management in my story and what makes visible this very famous event in New York about digitality. And that's exactly what I wanted to do in the context of this research and sabbatical. I wanted to stress this through the study of 7 archives. And I wanted to include in my story what happened at the same time. It's very strange because it's happened exactly at the same time. Most event that I found in my archive. It's the emergence of management as an institution. And you see on this slide many things you already know. Let me start with management. I had the opportunity to collect all the archive of the Academy of Management. I didn't know that at Cornell, I could find all the letters, all the archive of the Academy of Management for the 40s. I didn't know that the Academy of Management was set up a couple of days after Pearl Harbor. I didn't know this, that the status of the Academy of Management were voted just a couple of days after Pearl Harbor. And of course, in the whole story of the Academy in the 40s, it's far from being neutral. I had the opportunity on this period and just before and after, of course, to collect data from more practitioners-oriented institutions of management. The Taylor Society that appeared just before World War I, but that becomes really something with World War II, and the American Management Association. And again, what is very interesting for management as an institution is that most dates, important dates that I found, they are around this period and the period that I found for digitality. And what I discovered and what I try to make explicit, of course, is the many connections there are between the right hand of this slide and the left hand of this slide, over archives that I used to study digitality in New York. Big digital actors and big digital networks in New York. And I found amazing and very funny connections in the context of New York. Common actors, common practices, common events. It was very funny also at some point because I didn't expect this to discover that NYU was the place where people on the right or the left side of my slide met. It was a very funny to discover this in my archives. And of course, in the background of this story of the encounter between digitality and management in the 40s, there is World War II. I'm not claiming that the starting point of my research is that original, because for those who know Peter Drucker, you know that he wrote a book in the last 2 days of World War II, and you probably have on mind that what he says in this book, the first one, it's that World War II has been extremely important, and he wrote it in his second book as well, in the emergence of management. And he has already insisted in the relationship between management and computer and calculative devices. But he states things without any data, without any archives. The Peter Drucker thesis about the relationship between management and World War II or calculative devices and World War II is explicit in his writing, but there is nothing as archive to demonstrate it. So that's what I've tried to do in this book. You all know the story of the industrial mobilization during World War II. You all know that at the beginning of the war, the US were the 19th army in the world, just after the Netherlands, that they were experiencing an amazing crisis, that they were an isolated country, and that after the war, they are the first army in the world, that they produce 50% of the world GDP. And that's what Peter Drucker says, that they have established global management based on the very logistic of the US Army and some connections with the US consulting industry. So there is a very interesting black box in this story. And I think part of this black box is in the two books of Peter Drucker. So you all have on minds all these iconic images about World War II, mass productions, Manhattan Project, Overlord Project. And what I found interesting when I look at the writings of historians, not business historians, but historians of World War II and specific journals. And I must admit, as it is a passion this period of time, it was a pleasure to read articles written by historians of World War II. I discovered that there are a lot of things written in this field, and they all show an interesting things, which is that management as a technique, a terminology, and a way to label the world, it was present in the way these people of that time talked about what they were doing for the American industry and the way they were doing this work. They already talked about project management, logistics, and so on. So the thesis I try to defend in the book is a relationship between the need for provisional mass production. The US knew that very quickly at the end of the war, they had to reconvert their industry in something else. So it was a very flexible kind of Taylorism, the tools, the practices, the standard, settle something that in the book I try to label or present as something temporal. So I use in the book the notion of Hartog of temporal regime, a notion you may know, which is heavily influenced by hermeneutics. A temporal regime is an institutionalized and institutionalizing way to connect or disconnect the past, present, and future in a narrative with material constitution. It is in a way the institution of institutions, the institutionalizing processes of our organizations and society. And if I try to identify the temporal regime that is settled by World War II and the encounter between management and digitality, I could present it this way and contrast it with what is already present in some more contemporary writing, the following way. So presentism for 1939 and what has been settled by World War II till the late 90s, with a strong focus on present time, weak relationship with the past, something best shared with the past, legitimates a unique future by and for experts. From a managerial perspective, there are teams and tools which are here and now. The future is a business policy ahead. Digitality, it's something heavily material. And about the geopolitics of digitality, it's something really military in a polarized world. We all know that till the 60s, the digital industry has been massively financed by the army, in particular the US Army, and of course it's not neutral. And if I look on the other column, present in crisis, here we have a more exclusive focus on an individual present, a much more decentered management, connective management. And if we are in this liberal world, then the idea of collaborative tools like Lotus Notes, this old technology, collaborative spaces, collaborative places are urgent, precisely because we are in an individual world, which is the main feature, which epitomizes this new world. Digitality is a materialization at our fingers, movement, gestures, a way of thinking. Digitality at large becomes a movement. And about the geopolitics of digitality and management, digitality becomes an implicit dissenter war phenomenon. I want to keep a mystery about what I identify for the whole book as a kind of way to tell a coherent story. And I've used in the book this very funny person, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, not only because, as you all know, he was precisely present in New York during World War II. He spent 3 years, but also because as I tried to make a fiction for this book, to avoid making it boring, I built a fiction. I wrote it in a very fictional way, and I used the story and the vision of this guy on the slide to write this book for many reasons. I just give you a very strange example. You all know that management has been invented in New York, at the time of the Taylor Society on October the 11th in 1911. You know that it's the birth date of management as an institution, and that it's been invented at the New York Athletic Club. And it was very funny. I discovered that the birthplace of management was 800 meters away from the apartment of Saint-Exupéry. And for a fiction, it's very funny because I discovered a lot of coincidences like this one. And to write the story, it was very interesting. So let's go to the conclusion. So many journalists, researchers, politicians, even the Queen of England have drawn a parallel between the COVID crisis and World War II. And what I try to show in the book is that I don't think that, of course, the COVID has anything in common with a war. It's not, again, World War II. But I think, and it's a different argument, that there is an imprint of World War II. This relationship we have with time, this sense of urgency, presentism, that was part of World War II, and the technology duels at the time of World War II, they are part of the problem today. And the COVID crisis just make visible this problem that we have all experienced at the individual level, isolated in our apartments or our houses. Interestingly, Macy people called for new semiosis. Their electronic brain was something for the soldiers, the politicians, the managers, and they expected it to be a rational source of peace. And there is a strange paradox for these very utopian people. I think they have invented a nightmare described by Shoshana Zuboff, but they wanted the opposite. And just to conclude, I think that in a way they have created a new war. And it's a war against our toughest enemy, ourself, or our self that we live today. We have moved from a war with the first digitality and temporal structure that was against an external enemy, and then enemies are everywhere, and at some point the enemy becomes ourself that we try to self-optimize. We are inhabited by digitality itself, and we keep fighting, and we keep fighting against what? We keep fighting against ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I was there's a number of questions that came up here, and one of them that Mark raised was, how do you characterize this nexus between management and digitality? How did they do that in the 1940s? How should we do that today? Mark suggests is it an aesthetic, a sensibility, a logic, a paradigm, a discourse, or we sit as information systems researchers in that broad nexus, but what is it and what was it then?
I think it's really and simply an encounter. Very simply, people met in the 40s in New York. People interested in the issue of calculating, and people interested in the issue of managing. Very simply, if you look at the Manhattan Project, it's just a question of people meeting in 40 different places in the US, at the beginning in New York and continuously in New York for the Manhattan Project. And very simply, that's what I try to tell as a story in the book. It's just a question of people meeting in a room with different skills. And because they had to at this time, and because there were a lot of money from the US Army, a lot of money. The best academics of that time, scientists, they came, the best managers, the biggest car manufacturers, they came. It's just a question of encounter. And for also patriotic reasons, it was obvious that they couldn't say no. And so very simply, and New York was an amazing hub for this, in particular, a very small area of 8 or 10 blocks in Manhattan. I mean, a lot of very simple encounters took place there. So my answer is very simple. They met because they had to.
But also, there's some Steve. I don't know who Steve is, but Steve here said, that it was interesting that Macy participants were also present at the pivotal AI workshops at Dartmouth, including Ashby, Shannon, McCulling, etc., and also that the role of operations research. And I was struck as well by you putting forward this utopian vision, and you raised the Macy conferences, the Dartmouth conferences, and the Manhattan Project. And I was struck by, I don't know if you've read George Dyson's book, The Turing's Cathedral, which talks about the rise of the early computers as being entwined with the Cold War. I just wondered how far your utopian vision stretches, or was it just, it was a kind of a utopia through rationalism and through building the atomic bomb, which most of the early computers were used to assist in. Where the atomic bomb was sort of utopian in that it would solve all wars by no one having another war.
There are a lot of continuities between the utopia that emerged during World War II and right after II, and a lot of very old utopia. I even tried to come back in the book to some logic of calculus of the Middle Age, for instance, actualization processes. It's a very old techniques of the Middle Age, and it's a very digital philosophy. So there are a lot of logics or utopia that are extremely old, but there is kind of acceleration, crystallization that happened at that time. They did not invent anything, but they crystallized, they made visible, and there was really a major acceleration at that time because they had to win the war, and then to win the Cold War, they had to. And I think that there's been a very interesting writing at MIT about this, but I cannot remember the name of the researcher who say that the Soviet Union has lost the war against the US precisely because some weakness about management and digitality. The way the encounter took place in the Soviet Union was very different. And I can find the reference about these two books and articles at MIT, but I also find his reading fascinating, and it's a coherent and explanations also about the same issue.
Yeah, and Marx raised the issue of presentism, which you were talking about, and how it resonates with this sort of shifting baseline that governs the erosion of public goods or of our life. You talk about surveillance capitalism emerging out of this, but it also emerges to an extent, or new changes emerge because of presentism, where in the middle of a COVID crisis, we're prepared to accept massive changes in work practice or in lifestyle or in those things. And he asks, is there anything specific about materiality of digital that encourages presentism and therefore that erosion of public goods?
I would say that materiality as a consequence is related to a narrative, and this encounter now is producing a broken narrative. I will draw a parallel with the situation I have lived in the US, because there is the COVID crisis, but this awful political situation. I really understand what's happening with the movement Black Lives Matter. And you can look at this horrible situation in the US from a special perspective, saying that there's been segregation, that some minorities in the US, Native American, people of color, could not access some places. And I think it was true, and it is still true. And you can tell a different story. And then comes materiality, temporality. I think that, and this is my embodied experience of the US, what I see as the drama of the US is that part of the people in the US, temporarily and from a narrative point of view, the way the past is told, it's not their story. They are stuck in an individual present, and when they look back, everything institutionalized as a past. It's not their past. But it's the same for the future. When they look ahead, the legitimate future told by some people is not their future. So I think that the racial issue, the awful situation in the US, and I was really shocked by the situation. You can tell a spatial story, but you can say also a temporal narrative story. And for me, this story is also told, related to what I try to say in this book. I think that in a very broad and subtle sense, management and digitality have a responsibility in this situation. The organizing processes in the US, which means what we are all interested in, have a responsibility if we look at them from a temporal perspective. It's not just a question of in and out, which is broken. It's a question of before and after, related to the present, individual present, which is disconnected. So, and then materiality comes after as a consequence in the narrative, or it is told, lived on the TV, public meetings, at school, etc.
I'm very conscious of time, and I'd like us to sort of finish on time. I'd happily spend the whole evening chatting to you about these. And it's a fascinating account, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about the book. But I think
Me too.
I just to finish. Nigel Melville says, very insightful observations about Black Lives Matter, not our past, not our future. And I thought that bridging between past and future is a fascinating issue for us to engage with, and fits back to conversations about practice that we were having before with Michael, particularly, and indeed the conversations we were having around Uber before the big break. I'm going to move on, though, just so that we can kind of keep the pace. And I'm incredibly pleased to have Mike Chiasson join us now for the last presentation of the afternoon. And Mike wasn't able to join us earlier because he's in British Columbia, and nobody wants to get up that early. So Mike's joining us at this point, but we almost pivoted the whole afternoon around the paper that Mike wrote on thinking about the future and recalling futurology into the role of IS, and I think that was quite influential in trying to think of seismic changes like COVID, which could have significant change onto our society. Being, how does our past, our understanding of the temporal past from information systems and the research that we've done, how can we frame that to help us understand this change and perhaps how policy response changes? So I was incredibly pleased to invite Mike along. I met Mike intermittently over many years, but his research around the development, implementation, and outcome of information systems, particularly in the healthcare area, has been hugely influential. And he uses a lot of interesting theories that we would be, as a community, would be aware of from ANT, Habermas, pragmatism, etc., and language theories. And I was very keen to have him. So, Mike, having made a mess of introducing you, I will hand.
Great. No, well, and thank you for the invitation and for having me talk with you in your afternoon. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to talk. I also apologize for missing the previous presentations, but I did get some wonderful notes from Wendy to help me get up to speed, so I wasn't completely coming in as if from a vacuum somewhere. So my presentation will be fairly short, probably even overly simple at some level, but I hope we'll spur some conversations. The tentative title and the sketch I outlined today is on recalling the future in IS research texts. And I know many of you are probably getting to the point where tea time is approaching and things like that. So I always start usually my presentations with the point. What's the point? Really, I think there's two ways I'm trying to think and maybe draw upon Latour's idea of recalling here. The first is to recall representations of the future in IS research texts, and admittedly, this is a simple view of the texts in IS research. But really, the question is asking, how do the texts inform the future of information systems? And then how do they collectively together across their various textual strategies attempt to contribute to those future studies in IS? So in a sense, trying to recall where is the future in our texts and the strategies we employ. But I must admit the sketch part of today really has to do with this unique and inverted opportunity, in quotes, with COVID-19, where many things that are happening as a result of COVID-19 give us an opportunity to recall the work that we've already done that could inform these altered socio-technical futures that we see appearing in front of us. And so I'll spend the presentation talking about these two forms of recall here. Certainly when it comes to situations relevant for information systems research. There's much to see in the news these days and in what's happening. This is just a sample across the Guardian, the New York Times, and the Globe and Mail in Canada just in the last couple of weeks related to topics that are very relevant to what we do within the information systems field. And I'll come back to these towards the end as I think about recalling the texts that could be relevant to this work. So in terms of the first part of recall, where is the future in IS research texts? I really just pull out in a simple form 3 ways that we try to, in our texts, inform the future of information systems research. And really, this is in the paper with Liz Davidson and Jennifer Winter that talks about these various strategies and argues for what I've seen into even the presentation I saw just before, the more speculative ways that we could write text to inform the future. When Francois was mentioning the use of fiction, one of my fascinations is always with science fiction and the alternative genres as a way to inform the future. Admittedly, these are simple, so I apologize for that in advance. But one way we often try to influence the future is through prediction of various kinds, and there are strategies we do to make this possible. We have correlations through what Roby calls kind of variance research. I guess Alan Lee has more than on one occasion called it box and arrow types of diagrams too that show these kind of correlation coefficients. They are an attempt to predict the future in various ways, at least to anticipate the pathways through which things might happen. There's also other ways that we do it through process theories. Again, just a rough characterization in terms of anticipating the types of processes, how the world will emerge, whether through structuration theory or other types of theoretical approaches, even A&T, even forms of deconstruction at some level that I've used in some of my work. Now, typically on their own, these correlations cannot anticipate a particular outcome, but they're at least meant to constrain our view of what the future will be. And the process theories on their own are necessarily vague about the possible outcomes that might emerge, but certainly when they're applied in ways that Francois demonstrated earlier on to particular paths, they can provide very powerful narratives that can be used through analogy in order to inform the future. But simply on their own, there are some other things that they need to draw upon in order to inform the future. There's other ways we inform the future through explanation and abstraction from theoretical texts to be relevant to many futures. The purpose here, of course, for the theory is to say that there's something of essence captured here, even without being essentialist. And so these theoretical texts are meant to provide a way of guiding what that future will turn into. But on their own, they are often divorced from specific settings. So if our intention is to inform a specific future, there's work to be done. Starbuck and Dunbar even critique the idea that we have a kind of theoretical fetish in the way that we approach things. I disagree with that at some level. I think theories are important. But the abstractions do, by necessity, avoid the particularities of a particular future. And in the paper we discuss, again, on their own, they're only one of several strategies to inform the future. The part I'm most interested in, and I love participating in UK academic conversations because critique is always near the surface, and I enjoy I miss the language and the opportunities. North Americans tend to be a little more on the correlation variance side. But evident in any text is this kind of otherwise possibility that goes on. And I would suggest even in variance studies, there is a kind of critique going on about revealing the future. And I think within that critique, there are realist possibilities, correlational patterns, design science, often driven by kernel theories, is a type of kind of realism towards a type of critique in terms of artifact production. Even A&T, actor network theory, and sociomateriality, other variants coming out of that, have a type of realism to them that provide a critique of what could have been otherwise. Even action research work that I've done has fitting broadly within interpretive work is within an organization, anticipating a kind of intersubjective reality through participation that results in a transformation. And of course, there's the more directly emancipatory types of perspectives and work that I've done around communicative action. The issues, of course, with critique is that it's always most heavily dependent in some form on the other textual forms. And so on its own, it tends to, it can't really live on its own. Certainly, certain forms of critical theory have been critiqued from being somewhat divorced from specific realities. Although you listen to Terry Eagleton these days, Marx might have been right after all. So before COVID, so we argue this, and this paper was published before COVID, so I feel an awkwardness at a certain level to say that COVID has changed things when I get to my second view of recall. We argue future studies need to have and could further speculate on likely and desirable future scenarios to inform the present. I draw upon some of Hoy's work in saying that there really isn't a future or a present, so in a sense we're always dealing with a past of some kind. So our future studies is really meant to speculate on a future in order to inform and guide the present. We consider all texts important to this task, and specifically we draw upon Fiegenberg's ontological position about primary instrumentalization and secondary instrumentalization to argue that we need to explore more of the possibilities in the range of otherwise that could be realized in specific settings from technological systems and digitality. We also consider other ways to write more speculative texts of the future to inform the present. Just a bit of a note on this paper. It took us 10 years to publish this paper, and in its original form, it actually had a science fiction in it. And it's, sorry, I should say in its second revision, we put a science fiction into it. And even though it had been tentatively accepted before that, as soon as we wrote the fiction, it was rejected. And we figured that there was a certain kind of lack of legitimacy to producing science fictions, at least at that point. So I was happy to hear that Francois is considering a fictional scenario in his work, right? So now COVID-19 comes along, and I must admit this is a late shift in my thinking just yesterday in terms of inverting what's going on here. And COVID-19, I think, allows a second form of recall of the future in information systems work. It's certainly has dramatically, and I think hearing Michael talk earlier, increased the need for instantiation of IT in numerous social settings worldwide. So suddenly, many people are confronting technical systems that they didn't have to confront before. And in many respects, it provides an opportunity to bring forward yes, many of our existing IS texts to inform the present and future. So I provide just some tentative examples, realizing this is a sketch, so my apologies for it not being as tight as maybe other topics. In terms of social media, Facebook plans voter turnout push, but will not bar false claims from Trump. There's been huge discussions about social media and the role of the social media platform providers in governing and examining the content that comes through them. And we also see things like Grindr dating app removes ethnicity filter to support Black Lives Matter. There's much work in our field on data governance, social media work, government policy related to IT, e-government. There's lots of work on infrastructures. And then there's lots of work on sort of institutional entrepreneurship around legitimacy that can be brought forward, recalled is what I'm saying, in order to bring this about. Privacy and surveillance, I heard the comments earlier about how this actually pulling out privacy and surveillance might actually restrict some of the conversation. So I'm gonna have to go back and pay a little more attention to that. But the Babylon Health data breach, GP app users able to see other people's consultations, and big tech zeroes in on the virus testing marketplace. We can see sort of workplace surveillance, health, security, and privacy and even some of the work that I did a number of years ago on A&T, looking at privacy and the government's own breach of its own privacy policies. There's much work that we've done in this area to inform these contemporary issues, and so I'm recalling that work. There's also virtual work, affordance, and techno-stress, multi-million-dollar opportunity for virus-proofing the new office, and Zoom fatigue. Here we all are in Zoom, talking with each other from our homes. Here's why video conferencing leaves you feeling tired. Again, much work on socio-technical design, affordance, socio-materiality. Virtual work, virtual teams, and techno-stress are possible recalls that we can bring to bear on these topic areas. So in terms of recalling literature relevant to our current world, these are some examples. I also, I actually added this about an hour ago, and so I apologize. It's a little bit loose at the end. You can tell I've been thinking about this topic quite a bit over the last week. I also see these kind of critique inversions, prediction and explanation to counter critique. So here's an example. This is actually just from The Guardian this morning, how Trump and his public health officials diverge on COVID-19, often seem to abandon the appearance of unity. It's one of those cases where we're seeing data and systems brought to bear on trying to counter the almost type of postmodern world that Trump and his group are trying to promote in terms of no real crisis, the success of their handling of COVID. And so we actually see prediction and numbers, the type of technical rationality we would normally critique, actually coming to our rescue in some respects as a type of counter critique to what I often see as kind of postmodern move by Trump and his group in a very rough sense when I see these types of articles. I also see something interesting. This was just from this morning as well from the New York Times, returning to some of IS social theoretical roots. There was a paper we did on Gramsci, which actually looked at how ERP consultants implement in organizations and use language to disarm local communities while they bring in certain forms of technical rationality. Well, it's interesting when you see things like this with Trump at 36%, despite clearly not deserving those numbers, at least in my view. Well, you almost go back to Gramsci and some of his prison notebooks, where he was really quite interested in understanding why the Italians decided to vote for Mussolini even when they had the freedom to vote otherwise, right? So, and in it, you see a kind of linguistic turn to in the Marxist vein and other neo-Marxism towards it. And so there's actually a fair bit of social theoretical roots and work that we've done in the IS field that can actually inform topics that might be considered outside of our field of IS. So I guess to conclude this somewhat rapid journey in the interest of time, and I know that many of you are getting close to your limit here, the future for IS research text is bright for digital innovation research in the midst of this kind of misfortune. There's so much going on that is relevant to IS texts and to the writing of IS texts to inform. And these texts which speak to this emerging future can surely help with these contemporary circumstances. And so I again, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk today, and apologies for coming in so late. And happy to hear from people. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you. There's been an interesting set of conversations going on the chat. And just to remind everybody to have a look and post your questions on the chat. You should also look, there's a number of sources that have been popping up and being discussed. One of the questions that I'm just going to go through some of the ones in order. Information systems do encode prejudices, kind of prejudgments. Just because it can be classified, counted, and measured doesn't mean it should be. This was from Alan Higgins, and I think there is a kind of interesting question around that issue of prejudice in data and in text, and how we select and form text.
Yes, yeah. So I agree. I think. Certainly, yeah. With text, it has a certain ability to exclude as well as include. And certainly from some of my deconstructive readings and writing on that issue, drawing on some of Derrida's ideas that text perform and in a certain sense erase possibilities as well as produce that future. And so again, yeah, when you look at correlation studies or text or any sort of writing, there's always a wariness, at least on my part, having delved into some of those language philosophies, to understand what we are excluding in the process of writing. And so I agree wholeheartedly with that view, right? And I hope I answered the question or maybe the comment or addressed it, but I agree.
Actually, yeah, I mean, I think you did, Mike. I wondered if pushing a little bit further onto your postmodernism of Trump, to which, could you comment on temporality in the sense we produce texts which are kind of assumed in society to have this past-based capturing of reality, when in a sense Trump is framing texts for a future in which he tends to act. I mean, these things imply into a future and create a new future in which they imagine new texts that will arrive, which will dispense with and then leads to a kind of unfolding imagined future impacting on the temporally present selection of text. Does that make sense? In a sense,
yes.
We're always projecting into the imagined future and bringing that into what we're writing today when drawing on the past.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Yeah. And again, in terms of the use of the idea of postmodern in Trump's agenda, there is strangely in it also an extreme conservatism, obviously, in it as well, at least in terms of what it allows to happen. Because certainly under the guise of various positions as a populist president, he is then allowing the Senate and others to issue policies and tax reform, quote, reforms, that allow other things to happen as a result, right? So texts do then allow that a set of future possibilities and actually cover a certain kind of cover for actions that are hidden, right? So in that sense, maybe I agree with Eagleton, Terry Eagleton, that there is a form of maybe no surprise to people from the LSE, but a certain type of Marxist agenda that's being realized within that as well. So
on a different track, Marek asked around social science fiction research, and that there's been some work done in organization studies. And does that research stream have no future? And could you elaborate on where you think social science fiction research? I mean, I remember there was an IFIP 8.2 conference, which I think we both wrote for, but not much since. But she points out some very interesting literature, actually some of it from in organization studies from 2018, looking at fiction and org studies. But where is it within IS?
Yes, yeah, I was actually the lead on that IFIP 8.2 session in 2011, and I was the one who proposed alternative genres. And the LSE group came and presented a very, very good illustration of a fiction related to a particular technological assemblage, I guess it may be the best way to describe it. I think when it comes to texts, one of the things that concerns me about the texts we write for journals, and in particular journals, is that the genre themselves restrict the possibilities of what we can write about and how we can represent, transform what we see in the work that we do. And I must admit, I'm not familiar with that 2018 piece, right? So I'll go and have a look at it as well in the org studies. But I think these fictions, I think there's always, at least my impression with people who I've talked about with fictions, many people see fictions as a kind of false thing that can't be seriously written about because it doesn't exist. And yet they don't seem to understand that when they're writing about the work that they're looking at, there is a type of fictionalization process going on just by selecting the words we use to describe what it is we're examining. So So if the point is that there's still some troubles with this, I think, I think there's a greater discussion to be had. I know Lars Mathieson had also had an alternative genres special issue, I think, within the European Journal of Information Systems. And again, there hasn't been much take from that, I think, since that point. So.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if it was I wrote the paper on Solaris, the science fiction story Solaris at that 8.2, and it was based on empirical data that we simply couldn't share if we named if we gave any hint of what the organization was. In some ways it was empirically more rich because the story actually captured things that you weren't able to write about if you just wanted interviews and quotes to build your data. So this is kind of an interesting issue of the reality versus non-reality. Let me make sure I cover people's questions.
Yes.
Monadeepa asks, I'm wondering how recall is different from replication and contextualization. And she's thinking about technostress in particular here.
Yep. Okay. Recall different from replication. Yes. 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 I think certainly if you think of replication in the sense of bringing about studies which try to confirm, disconfirm, examine, change work that's already there, or work that has been published previously, there is a certain process, pattern, approach to replication. So when I talk about recall and bringing forward ideas in the information systems field to inform contemporary issues, there is, I suppose, an element of replication. But I must admit, with replication studies, I often have a view of replication studies that if they do achieve an outcome showing exactly what happened in a very somewhat different context, but within a brand new one, that it's more a production of the research community than it is necessarily a reality in terms of the recall. So I guess I'm arguing that recall is a more expanded view, which might bring sort of analogical thinking and other approaches to these contemporary problems. Now with the technostress specifically, right? I guess I certainly think there's much in the technostress literature from what I've seen that can be brought to bear on things like the example I was showing about Zoom and it's the stress it creates. Whether there's specific work on technostress associated with these types of social media, video conferencing platforms, I wouldn't know. So I think recall, I'm looking at it as a more broader agenda, maybe beyond the replication, if I'm answering the question correctly there. So
I think so.
Yes.
Okay. I think we should probably bring it to a close anyway.
Okay.
One point just to finish on was Rosé wrote around desirable change and desirable future, and I thought that was a really interesting point, drawing on Simon, that many times we talk about the desirable future not being made explicit, and in our research we talk about we're very reticent to put future as a kind of outcome of policy recommendations or strength of future within our work. So I think there's some kind of interesting debates around that side of things. But I'd like to just finish by calling on Wendy just to conclude. So Wendy she's just moved back to Amsterdam, or she'd be based there, and she's joining us as rapporteur and just to capture the zeitgeist of the afternoon. So if I could just hand over to Wendy, and maybe she could give us some final pointers for a couple of minutes, and then we'll close the session. But thank you, Mike, so much for joining us so early and for coming into this this afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Yes, thanks everyone for joining us. So yeah, indeed, I've been asked to provide a short summary with highlighting key points, which is very, very difficult because all the talks have been very interesting and very important points have been made, many points. So I'm going to try anyway. So first of all, I'd like to highlight that speakers have introduced us to a lot of interesting initiatives, solutions, and ideas, right? We had Edgar at first, who introduced us to new, easy to use, modestly priced, remote, and digitally secure ways to identify and authenticate people. Then we had Marijke, who focused on algorithmic management and surveillance apps. She highlighted that algorithms can actually become your boss, which now that I say it out loud sounds kind of scary. Then we had Mark, who explained this process of continuous reconfiguration and how, you know, reconfiguring tech capabilities and organizing vision really allows organizations to actually generate rapid responses now during the COVID crisis. Then we had Michael, who gave examples of telemedicine and robots that move between hospital beds, right? Really highlighting the role of place and time. Francois, who shared us his amazing journey, actually, and story of how digitality met management. I had no idea of this history, and I cannot wait to read his book. And then finally, Mike, thank you for sharing your ideas on the future of IS text, and also highlighting that, you know, many existing insights and past text can actually still be useful today. So I think we can agree that many of the technological solutions and deployments that, you know, all the speakers have introduced have really been pushed because of this COVID situation. And also these technologies have really proven to be very valuable in dealing with this crisis. But there are still a lot of challenges that we still need insights on. I mean, concerns have been raised around the inclusion and coverage of all users and all members of populations. We've heard concerns about huge increases in online fraud and the need to actually take multiple measures to reduce the risk of fraud. We've heard concerns about user experience in general, right? There's so many different digital solutions that users can now apply, and they really need to be able to make sense of that. We've heard concerns about public acceptance of technologies also after this whole crisis is over, hopefully when it's over. And of course, there's this question and struggles around the political implications and also this relation between organizations, the public, and then governments. So I think we as researchers, we have our job cut out for us, right? We need to, first of all, I think, determine, and this has also been raised by a number of participants, we need to determine what I as researchers know and can already apply that we already know from the past that we now can apply during these times so that we can contribute rapidly. Sometimes we seem to be reinventing the wheel, right? So we need to, maybe I misunderstood, but as Mike also mentioned, recall existing theories. Marijke encouraged us to try and shorten our publication processes, to focus a bit more on practical relevance and really try and communicate with the public. This is also something that I think Michael highlighted. He suggested maybe we should be on TV. So I'm definitely in favor of that. At the same time, you know, people have still highlighted the importance of theory and abstraction. Although, you know, Mike, you admitted that it took you 10 years to publish a paper, so maybe we should focus a bit more on quick turnarounds. Yeah, and then also Michael, of course, highlighted the value of practice approaches that are still relevant even now, even more now in today's digital era and during and after this crisis. So, I mean, many interesting insights. I hope that was a somewhat useful summary. If I have to put it in Mike's words, I think I have reached my limit after 6 presentations, but I really enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I do. And I hope we can all drink beers afterwards after this. So thank you. Will, do you want to add something?
Just thank you, Wendy, for working behind the scenes and streaming the questions and various other things. And thank you for everybody for attending. This kicks off DIIESL with a fantastic start, and we will try to live up to this with our next seminar, which will be in October, and we'll be broadly on the e-government space, and we're starting to pull that together at the moment. If you signed up to this seminar via Eventbrite, then we will send you an email to invite you to the next event. If not, then either sign up on Eventbrite or send Wendy and I an email, and we'll make sure that you're on the list. But it's been a fantastic start, a fascinating afternoon, and it's gone incredibly quickly given all the huge range of things. So thank you so much to our speakers for attending. Thank you for people for coming. I'm really sorry we can't go off for a cold beer afterwards physically, but I would love to have taken you all for a beer afterwards. And next time you're in London, give us a shout and we'll do that. So thank you.